Once again, a very warm welcome to all, and thank you for the journey you've made and the time you have given. There are a number of welcomes to new members and also a couple of other things. First of all, I think for the first time we are blessed with the presence of primates of the Anglican Communion to join with us and observe our business and take part at various moments. I'm going to call them out and ask them to stand, and may we welcome them warmly at the end. There are just three. They are Archbishop Winston Halapua, the primate of one of the three primates of New Zealand, and the Archbishop of Polynesia, the largest province in the world, which is about 99% sea. And we will remain standing, please, Your Grace. Archbishop Thabo Makgoba, the Archbishop of Southern Africa, which includes Mozambique, Angola, and various other places, and also Bishop Humphrey Peters, the Bishop of Peshawar, and the moderator of Pakistan, President Bishop of Pakistan. May we please welcome them. They all have extraordinary stories you will find in the tea breaks. It's well worth, really very rewarding to spend time with them. Archbishop Winston lives in an area where climate change is not a theory, but a lived reality. Bishop Humphrey Peters comes from one of the most persecuted churches on the face of the planet. And Archbishop Thabo is leading the design group for the Lambeth Conference and has lived through the extraordinary experience and been a major participant in the extraordinary experience of transformation in South Africa. It's a great privilege to have them. Secondly, I don't know if the Bishop of Norwich is here, but I think we're going to record this anyway. I don't think he is. Either that or he's keeping his head very down. Bishop Graham James will, in a couple of weeks, celebrate, just under 2 weeks, will celebrate on the feast of St. Polycarp, interesting combination, his 25th anniversary of his consecration as a bishop. And so I hope we can indicate our thanks to him now, and that we can congratulate him when we see him. And then I would very much like to welcome new members since our last meeting. I wonder if they would be so kind, if it is convenient to them, they are comfortably able to do so, to stand or to wave, and then we will greet them all with applause at the end of the list. It's quite a long list. The Right Reverend Tim Thornton replacing the Right Reverend Nigel Stock. That's quick. They don't normally go, oh, he is here. Right. The Very Reverend Jane Hedges replacing the Very Reverend Dr. Francis Ward. The Venerable Joanne Kelly-Moore replacing the Venerable Philip Down. The Reverend Canon Cameron Butland replacing the Reverend David Craven. The Reverend Brenda Wallace replacing the Reverend Jonathan McNeely. The Reverend David Tolhurst replacing the Reverend Dr. Miranda Threffel Holmes. The Reverend Prebendary Kate Edmonds replacing the Reverend Canon Andrew Godsall. The Reverend Prebendary Carl Freeman, replacing the Reverend Canon Anna Norman Walker. The Reverend Canon Sir George Newton, replacing the Reverend Canon Martin Neal. The Reverend Canon Paul Rattigan, replacing the Reverend Amanda Fairclough. The Reverend Sally Hitchener, replacing the Reverend Canon Philippa Boardman. Reverend Anne Stevens, replacing the Reverend Andrew Forshaw Kane. Reverend Francis Orr Ewing, replacing the Reverend Kate Stacey. The Reverend Beverly Hollins, replacing the now Right Reverend Dr. Guli Francis Ducani. The Reverend Rachel Wilson, replacing the Reverend Lucerne Zenga Gogoy. The Reverend Andrew Morton Mumby, replacing the Reverend Canon Dr. Stephen Hunt. Mr. Richard Morgan, replacing Mrs. Helen Lamb. Mr. Stephen Hoffmeyer, replacing Mrs. Anne Martin. The Reverend Canon Dr. James Walters, replacing the Reverend Dr. Hannah Clue. The Reverend Dr. Philip Plimming, replacing the Reverend Duncan Dormer. Loretta Minghella, replacing Sir Andreas Whittam-Smith. Miss Annika Matthews, replacing Mrs. Leah Bell. May we greet them all. We welcome also very much the Right Reverend Dr. Lee Rayfield, Bishop of Swindon. Where is he? Over there, right at the back there, Lee. Attending during the vacancy in the See of Bristol. You are most welcome. Bishop Lee has speaking rights, but does not have voting rights. That concludes our introductions and welcomes, and I accordingly now hand over to the chair of our first debate.
So we come now to item 2, which is a report by the Business Committee. And for this, you'll need GS 2079. And I'm going to ask the chair of the Business Committee, Reverend Canon Sue Boys, to come and speak to it. And she has up to 10 minutes.
Boys, Oxford 186. Friends, welcome to the February group of sessions. We are meeting at a slightly unaccustomed time for a London Synod, and I want to thank in advance those of you who find staying until Saturday more difficult. We are meeting like this for those who are not here, because we hope that younger lay people may be encouraged to stand for election if Synod meets over fewer working days. The Business Committee would welcome hearing your feedback on this trial after the Synod. A welcome new feature of this Synod is the presence of our Anglican Communion guests, whom Archbishop Justin has already greeted. It is really good to be reminded of our wider context in a similar way to the broader understanding that our ecumenical representatives bring us. We look forward to hearing from them tomorrow morning. I hope you've noticed that GS 2078, the report of the Business Committee, has a very slightly different format for this group of sessions. We've tried to arrange this in a slightly more user-friendly way, hoping that you will use it as your go-to document for understanding the agenda. The Business Committee report is like the BC itself, non-partisan and committed to the creation and management of the best possible agenda for the current and future mission of the Church. The report is arranged according to the three main areas of our work together. Synod is a legislative body and legislation our primary purpose. An important focus is the way we order our life together. And thirdly, there is the business that we debate because we want to express our concern for the world and our neighbours. Before I consider the agenda for this group of sessions, I want to reflect briefly on the importance of our legislative business, sharing a concern aired at a recent Business Committee meeting. This Synod and the Church of England in whose government we share has its basis in law. Our activities are shaped by the synodical government measure of 1969, as is our power to pass measures which become part of national law. Much of this significant responsibility is undertaken carefully and properly in committee. When legislation comes to the floor of Synod for our consideration, each Synod member has an important role. We are the people who live in and minister to the parishes whose lives will be governed by the legislation we pass. It is not enough, might I suggest, to leave the legal business to those who understand that kind of thing and catch up with our friends over a cuppa. The miscellaneous provisions measure we are considering tomorrow afternoon is a good example of this, and it's our responsibility to ensure that we understand its effects and that the legislation we pass results in the church we want to be a part of. The primary function of this speech and the debate that follows is the consideration of what is and what is not on the agenda. Doubtless you will have questions about this. What is on the agenda? What is there but not in the form that you wanted? And why we felt that the scheduled business was important rather than something else. In our job to choose not the what but the when, the Business Committee considers proposals brought from a number of sources, and our report also offers an indication of future business. In addition to the legislative business I have already highlighted, other work that touches on the way we order our life together will include the opportunity to ask questions about safeguarding, a debate on the work of the CNC, and a consideration of the Anglican Methodist Covenant. Personally, I'm particularly looking forward to the debate on Anglican Communion partnerships. This combines the work of the Church with our voice in the world. The things we learn from our partners enables us to speak out on their behalf. This agenda also offers us an opportunities to speak out about food waste and to consider some complex issues arising from scientific developments around embryo testing, exploring and articulating the implications of this for society. As part of our ongoing work to make Synod more user-friendly, you'll find that the request to speak form has been updated, and amongst other things includes a question to ensure the best possible provision for accessibility. Roy McCluffrey, the National Disability Advisor, is here until tomorrow afternoon, and I hope you'll take the opportunity to speak to him about any particular concerns. Another new face is that of Jenny Jacobs, the new Head of Governance Services. To help you identify Ray, Jenny, and other members of the team, you'll find photographs on the board in the Bishop Partridge Hall. All the Synod staff give outstanding service, and you know that I always like to take the opportunity to thank the Synod team, the chaplain, and those who ensure the continuous praying presence. Another group of very familiar faces at Synod are those of the sign language interpreters. The grace and beauty they bring to Synod is always special for me. This Synod is the last for Mrs. Trudy Field, who has been one of the interpreters since 2005, when deaf Anglicans together were first welcomed to Synod as observers. Trudy has led the team of interpreters and become a familiar figure to Synod members, chasing information, pestering us for copies of speeches in advance, but always with great courtesy and good humour. Trudy, I know you will not only be greatly missed by the DAT observers, but by the whole Synod. It simply remains for me to remind you to make certain you have read and observed the security briefings, that you don't leave bags in unexpected places, and to move the report of the Business Committee standing in my name. Thank you.
Members of Synod, may I remind you that in this particular debate, you are allowed to talk about the shape and the content of the agenda, i.e. what's in and what's not. If you want to talk about something that's not in the agenda and you think you should, you are free to do that, but you mustn't get into the substance of that particular subject. I'm going to impose a speech limit of 3 minutes from the outset. The matter is now open for debate. So I'm going to ask Prebendary Stephen Linus, followed by Mr. Sam Margrave.
Stephen Linus, Bath and Wells, number 60. Absolutely sticking, as the chairman has asked us, to what's in the report from the Business Committee. First of all, to echo back with thanks what two boys have just told us about the evolution that's taking place in the way Synod does its business. This report is entitled A Guide to the Sessions. It's a change in tone. And also, I certainly noticed, and I'm sure others have, that section 2 of the report, page 3, starting at paragraph 11, let's stick to the report, helpfully categorises the kind of things we do, and it's been suggested to me that that might be something we could usefully do when we get back home to report back. Standing items of business, legislative stuff, church in the world, ordering the life of the church, that's what we do here in Synod, and it's quite a helpful way of categorising the stuff. Another bit of evolution is the reform of the blue form, which makes it much easier for you and I, if we want to, make a speech to say why we want to do it, and I'm sure it makes the chair's job 20 times easier, because it's just going to be clearer what people want to say and what they bring to the debate. Having said all those nice things, can I please ask a question about the way questions are being dealt with in this report, referring to paragraph 12. I think I'm right in saying that we were given the questions document electronically 2 days before the question sessions happened, and I just want to ask if that's the right decision by the Business Committee and those who organise these things. Questions work best when it's free-flowing. Questions work best and are much funnier when there's a degree of spontaneity. And it seems to me that particularly in this group of sessions, where there are a number of quite tense questions about particular issues, if people get their answers too soon beforehand, they will over-prepare their supplementaries, and we won't have such a good time as we might otherwise do. So I would like to ask the Business Committee if they would like to think carefully about how the questions booklet is sent to us and when, so that we get that right in future. And also it raises a question of confidentiality. If I have it by email 2 days before the sessions, I can tweet about it, which actually I haven't done, but I could have done. I can send it to all my friends who will get upset about a particular answer, and we'll have a big shandang. So can we please just think carefully, while we congratulate the Business Committee and the staff for the evolution, let's just think carefully about how we prefix question time. Thank you.
After Sam Margrave, April Alexander.
Thank you, Chair, Sam Margrave, Coventry 292. Thank you, Chair, for calling me, and thank you to the chair of the Business Committee and the committee itself for all the hard work that you continue to do. Today, I wanted to speak about the church in the world. And while I appreciate that we seek to be relevant in respect of our agenda, and many things happen between setting the agenda and us meeting here, I wish to highlight briefly a matter and propose a proposal in relation to how we can be more relevant. Last week saw World Hijab Day. At the same time, it also saw Amanda Spielman, the Chief of Ofsted, and the National Secular Society, and one of our head teachers from our church schools, suggest there should be a ban on religious head coverings, and that this was against British values. Many people have been in touch with me concerned about this feeding into the narrative of hate and division. If we ban Muslims from wearing head coverings which do not cover the face, what next? The turban, the kippah, the cross? While it's too late to secure a debate on this issue at this synod, I wonder two things. First of all, whether the Business Committee could ask the President to issue a statement on behalf of this synod to send a clear message that we value the diversity within our church schools and condemn the vilification of any section of our communities for wearing religious articles. And we want to celebrate the role of faith plays in society because our difference makes us stronger, and we need to stand with others in the faith community against the tide of secularism that would see us erased from history. This is merely not an issue of school uniform policy, but an attack on faith in the public square. Furthermore, I wonder whether the Business Committee may, in future, explore the possibility of making available a space within these sessions for us to discuss issues that are more relevant and that come up in the weeks preceding the synod, possibly by us putting forward them a week or so before and us taking a vote on whether to debate an issue. So it would be a small amount of time to discuss something that's particularly relevant to the discourse of our nation right now and right here. Thank you, Chair.
After April Alexander, David Banting.
April Alexander, Southwark 410. No relevant interests, I think, in this question, and I hope I'll be finished in 30 seconds. I was away in July, so I may have missed the discussion and even a previous paper, but I would like to ask whether the Business Committee could consider similar provisions as are in GS MISC 1175, the Code of Conduct, whether they could consider whether these provisions should apply equally to elections, both to Synod and within Synod. Thank you very much.
After David Banting, Jane Ozanne.
David Banting, Chelmsford, number 80. Sections 10, 15, 19 and 43 tell us we now have a code of conduct. And now we've got a Saturday. Hooray for Saturday. However, we have not been given time for perhaps the most important business in the matter of why and how we disagree. Time has been persistently requested and patiently waited for, but we plough on with business and issues, but not engage with the grounds for our debate and for our decision-making. At the end of shared conversations at General Synod, we'd reminded ourselves again that we needed to behave to each other. And we called about 80% of the groups reporting back for serious engagement with the issue now, the Bible and theology that lies behind it. After all, we have real issues of disagreement, and we weren't looking at why we disagree and the grounds potentially for our agreement. And we really do disagree. We disagree about sin, what offends or displeases God. Therefore, we disagree about grace and the gospel and salvation. We do disagree, and members of Archbishop's Council now resign over that. We disagree about false teachers, whether such a breed exists, or if they do, who and what are they teaching that is wrong. And yet there are charges of Arianism, Pelagianism, Gnosticism thrown around
commenting on our debates of the last 15 months. So, November 2016, set aside for contingency business, no time given. The House of Bishops compiled their report, but that proves to be rushed, as we discovered in February 2017. Even in our own diocese, we weren't given time to discuss. July 27, we plunged on almost recklessly to discuss two very complex issues without due preparation, and our thin and slightly intemperate debate only revealed our professional ineptitude, both in science and in theology. November 2017, more contingency time, which we'd all kept in our diaries, been asked to, nothing, despite requests and appeal. And now February, we were asked to keep 4 days originally, they're cut down to 2. Bully for Saturday, which reminds me I'm missing a game of hockey on Saturday as a result. Bully for Saturday, but where's the time to discuss Bible and theology and to see why we disagree on that ground and how we may come to agreement? Our canons, A5, the Canon of Canons, the Declaration of Assent, Articles 20 and 21, the Ordinal itself, these are our formularies. They are where Anglicans turn for matters of faith and salvation, and certainly in controversies of faith. But we don't talk about the Bible, we don't talk about theology. Please, Business Committee, and those who may we have time. Thank you.
After Jane Ozanne, Jonathan Alderton-Ford.
Ozanne, Oxford 379. Chair, it seems that Thomas Hobbes was right. Writing during the tumultuous throes of a civil war, our father of modern political philosophy chose to entitle his seminal work on social contract theory, Leviathan. As such, Hobbes describes how large public institutions take on a form and nature of their own, quite independent from the individuals who serve in them. Leviathan, how aptly named, that monster of the deep. And I would suggest that the Church of England has a tendency at times to become a Leviathan, as I fear it can take on a nature and form quite different and independent from the boards, councils, and even General Synod that constitutes it. My overriding concern, which I aired at the very start of this quinquennium, is that there are times when it feels like Synod is being overly managed. I would like to ask the Chair of the Business Committee, what is the point of Synod if, having spent time and, dare I say, a good deal of money bringing us together so that we can come to a collective mind on key issues, but our decisions then appear to be either shelved, ignored, or treated as inconvenient by the powers that be? I speak, of course, of both my debate on conversion therapy last summer and indeed the debate requesting that the House of Bishops, not just a small subset who we have not previously heard of, reflect on the request for a liturgy that actively shows that we mean what we say about welcoming transgender Christians. I had hoped that the House of Bishops might have looked to show that they had learnt something from the strength of feeling voiced in the chamber last February, that they might have reflected on how best they could rebuild trust with various parts of a church that feel alienated and marginalised, that they might have shown their commitment in their deeds, not just in their words, particularly in relation to taking forward the will of Synod, but sadly not so. Most worryingly, we see the desire to managers in the decision, despite lots of requests to the contrary, to have a presentation rather than a proper open public debate on safeguarding, which is why I shall reluctantly be voting against this item. The decision not to enable the debate gives the impression that we have much to hide as a church. Synod is to be fed a line, and of course, if we're lucky, we might just get to ask a question. But in no way can we shine a spotlight on the systemic flaws such as the inexcusable lack of independence in our reporting systems or the fact that we have a system that fails our victims. No debate, no openness, risk leading to no truth and no trust. And my goodness, we do need to rebuild trust. Synod, we should be better than this. Indeed, we must be better than this for the sake of those we represent and for our future generations. But to do so, we will need a change of heart and a change of culture that seeks to take the will of Synod seriously and to show by our actions that we have listened and understood. Thank you.
After Jonathan Alderton Ford, Penny Allen.
Jonathan Alderton Ford, 207 St Edmundsbury, Ipswich. What I have to say now has all the hallmarks of being an old stager. When I came onto the Synod in 1999, it was a good thing to be able to meet some Synod members who'd actually been members of the preceding body, the Church Assembly. And for a price of a gin and tonic at the bar, they would tell you about the Herculean struggles they had to create Synod, and what a joy it was to bring the whole church together in one place to find the mind of the church and do the will of God. I am worried that as Synod gets shorter and shorter, we have actually less time together as fellow Christians. We listen to each other less. Indeed, there's almost a culture of you come with your particular group, you sit with your particular group, you say your things, and you don't engage with anybody else. Whereas with longer synods, particularly residential ones, you found that as you shared in the work together, people who were poles apart could actually find common ground in other areas, and this led to great friendships and a better understanding to each other. But the real danger that exists to Synod is there are certain people who are media savvy, who have the ability just before a Synod to use those forces to define the debate the Synod's about to have, tell the general world what we're going to do and why we should do it, and then immediately after tell us what the outcome was. And often what they say is nothing to do with what we've done. And on top of that, we are in a process of change. We are in a process of evolution. But, Synod, I say this to you with sadness, we persist in refusing to reform ourselves. One of the things we might do, and I hope Synod Business Committee could consider this, actually to go to the diocese and ask them how they want to be represented here, rather than us deciding how we want to be elected, which is not the same thing. So, Synod, I call on you to urge for longer debates, to spend more time listening rather than speaking, so that we can truly, well, we can't be the brains of the church, but we might have a fair stab at being the mind. Thank you.
After Penny Allen, Nigel Bacon.
Thank you for calling me. Penny Allen, Lichfield 335. Warmly welcome the Code of Conduct. Thank you to the Business Committee for that. And secondly, we received by our second post, those of us who have paper copies, 2 very lengthy, weighty, detailed reports about 2 bishops. Those reports had a very great many recommendations at the end. This is a plea, please, for the Business Committee to consider whether to send that type of information in advance of the other paperwork, considering that the papers were published well in advance of the dates of this synod, in order that we may read them properly. The weight of paperwork for this synod is great, and I think we've missed an opportunity in a way, both to discuss the recommendations and to absorb them properly. I have to say that I found the content of them distressing, and therefore trying to straight read that was extremely difficult. Thank you.
After Nigel Bacon, Martin Sewell.
Nigel Bacon, Lincoln 341. Thank you, Chair. And my thanks also to the Business Committee for the sterling work that they do and the way that they're improving the way that we organise our business. A couple of points I would like to raise out of the report. First of all, in paragraph 38, the Business Committee requests feedback on their experimental way of the tool they're providing, the Running Record Business Done, which is available to us on Members' Resources webpage. I would commend this. I found it a very helpful document, both as a reminder of what we've done and also as a summary of the actions required and what's being done to follow up on them. My one request is that as this is a rolling report, could they find some way of indicating in that follow-up section what has changed since the previous issue of the report? Then turning to the forecast of future business on the last page of the report, everything there is listed as July 28 and beyond. That means we don't actually know what is likely to come up on the July group of sessions. Now, I realise that the Business Committee are in an impossible position on this. They have no control as to when legislation will be ready to come forward, nor when reports will be ready for review. So I do have sympathy with the Business Committee in doing any form of forward planning. I do wonder, though, if it would not be possible, perhaps through standing orders, to require standing committees and groups preparing reports to at least give a provisional view of when they are likely to come forward for review at Synod. Such a requirement could generate a useful dialogue with the legal office and others who are supporting their work as to whether they can support the proposed timings with the much valued staff they have available to support that work. Now, I realise that things will change as problems are encountered and new issues arise, but having a provisional view of what will be on the agenda for the next synod, for the next group of sessions would, I think, be helpful. Thank you.
Martin Sewell, Rochester 391. Back in July, knowing that there would be no synod in November, members may recall that I pressed Bishop Peter Hancock to ensure that we had a significant safeguarding debate in these February sessions. I'm sure there might have been a reason for that. The Carlisle report has spoken of process, and this week, with the publication of the booklet of survivors' experiences, We Asked for Bread, but You Gave Us Stones, we've all been given a most harrowing picture of what real survivors of known modern abuse experience from the church that should heal them when we get it wrong. Just before Synod, I enjoyed a full and frank discussion with some senior church house figures about these difficult matters. We don't agree on everything and we couldn't discuss everything, but it was friendly and it was useful, so I have already had my say. But I suspect that the good folks sitting around here will also have a good deal to offer to put some of the problems right, based upon compassion, expertise, scripture, and good old-fashioned common sense. They need to contribute too. So, Sue, could you liaise with our archbishops to explore whether, as joint presidents of the Synod, they might use their powers under Standing Order 4.3 to direct the addition to the agenda of a debate on these urgent and important issues, so that they can hear what the representatives of the ordinary people in the pews have to say about these important matters. Thank you.
I see no one else standing, so I ask the chair of the Business Committee to reply to the debate. She has up to 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to begin by thanking Stephen Linus and others for the nice things they perhaps feel obliged to say about us at the beginning of each speech. And to answer some fairly specific things. Nigel Bacon, thank you for your feedback and for the evidence that gives of your careful reading of our report. We do discuss timings of legislative business with the legal department on a fairly regular basis. I'm very reluctant to do anything other than say July 2018 and beyond. I know, and some of you will remember to my cost, that you can plan a General Synod in December, and by February you are moving alterations to the order of business what feels like every 5 minutes. Planning beyond July 2018 would give me far too big a headache. Mr. Margrave, you return to a question which has vexed this Synod often in terms of being able to respond to things that are very immediately in the public mind at the time of Synod. There are problems with this, not least of which is the occasional under-preparation of speeches and preparatory papers brought to debate. We have tried in recent years to address this. One of the things that we've done is to indicate the nature of a motion but not bring the wording until much closer to the date of synod. And we have always the opportunity for the presidents to ask, as they did quite recently, us to introduce a specific item to the agenda after it has been published. We will continue to look at this. A number of comments and questions on the Code of Conduct, which we have noted and will look at in our regular residential meeting, which happens next month. Mr. Banting, I agree that we disagree, but we must continue to work and seek together over these issues to meet and to talk, not necessarily on this floor, but elsewhere. It is important, I think, to note that the teaching document is a large, significant and ongoing process which goes beyond synod and which I look forward to, being asked to schedule time in the future. A number of you have talked, as I expected you might, about having a presentation and questions with regard to safeguarding. I'd emphasise that the Business Committee schedules what we are asked to schedule. We can't dictate, much as we might like to. I do anticipate a request to schedule a debate about safeguarding, and I can assure you that when that request comes, it will receive our serious and immediate attention. Penny, the reports to which you refer were available in the public domain before they were sent out as part of the synod paperwork, but it may be that we can look at alerting synod members to the availability of reports like this in future. I would like to say that, Jane Ozanne, I can't answer your specific question about the outcome of the private members' motions in July, but those who can may wish to. And Jonathan Alderton-Ford, I agree, as another ancient old-timer. I can't see you, but I agree with you. There you are. But I would like to use this opportunity to make the point that everyone here is a communicator, and everyone here shares a responsibility to listen and to speak in their own diocese, whether that's at collections of deanery synods, whether it's with people in the pew, and actually take on the people who talk about General Synod. Personally, I wasn't at my last deanery synod, and I read with horror castigation of General Synod, based actually on those two private members' motions, which was based on a total misunderstanding of what we do. So please do take to heart the need to communicate at a personal level with the people in your diocese. If I haven't answered your question, time is against me. Do come and talk to me in the coffee room.
Thank you. So we need to put item 2 to the vote, that we take note of the Business Committee report. All those in favour, please show. All those against? That has been overwhelmingly carried. So that concludes item 2. Please stay in the chamber for the next item, which is on the Crown Nominations Commission. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to give an idea of what is going to happen both with items 3 and 4, first of all. So, under item 3, there will be a presentation and then there will be the opportunity for members to ask questions. Then when we move under item 4, this will be a take note debate on the report. I've received quite a number of requests to speak, so I plan to allow enough time for a proper debate at that point. And we also need to bear in mind, everyone, that questions is scheduled for 4 o'clock. Thank you. So let's move to item 3 on the agenda, which is a presentation on discerning in obedience, a theological review of the Crown Nominations Commission, which is GS MISC 1171. So I invite Professor Oliver O'Donovan, who led a theological review of the CNC, to give the presentation. Thank you.
Madam Chairman, thank you very much, and thank you, members of Synod, for your invitation to present our report, Discerning in Obedience. The Archbishops appointed theologians to review the CNC, not systems experts, no doubt with the thought in their mind that administrative tweaking would not achieve much unless there was a common understanding of what was to be accomplished. The review was therefore charged first with articulating the role of the CNC in the economy of the Church's life and ministry. Only secondly, with proposing how it might be helped to work better. Yet we have made some proposals, some of which are for the Archbishops to bring to the CNC, some to be brought to this Synod. They were described by one of the central members as on the revolutionary side of evolutionary, which, when unpacked, I presume means neither too bland nor too bloody. We shall be content if they strike other people that way too. The Archbishops may also have borne in mind that 8 theologians from different backgrounds in the Church will proverbially come up with 8 different views. Here, however, we defy proverbial wisdom, and I have the privilege of introducing to you a report on which the 8 of us converge as with a single mind. And that's not only a measure of how very agreeable my colleagues are, but also of some very clear and consistent messages that we heard from those who took the trouble to visit us or write to us and share their experiences. What, first of all, has to be understood more clearly about the nomination of bishops? First, that the work of a diocesan bishop is not, as it's often said, to be a dual role, as though a bishop spent half the time concerned with the interests of a diocese, the other half of the time concerned with the interests of the central church. It is a connectional or communicative role. The bishop does not eliminate differences or cobble together compromises, but interprets. He helps each worshipping community to see its concerns reflected in the life of the Catholic whole. Interpreting parish to parish, diocese to the wider church to the diocese, the bishop also interprets the church to the wider public. And all this requires very special gifts and a competent theological culture. Secondly, the task of nominating a bishop has to ensure that 3 things happen. First, that there is a continuity in the episcopal ministry as the Church has understood it. Second, that the bishop is recognized by the whole Church. And thirdly, that the Holy Spirit's gifts are employed to discern God's leading of the church. And the logic of a body like the CNC, as opposed to forms of open synodical election, such as is practiced in some other places, is that it allows those gifts to be exercised by those to whom they have been given. Two things are commonly said about its work, which we hope we've been able to elaborate and give some greater substance to. One is that it must exercise discernment. The other, that it must do so representatively. An act of discernment looks forward. It focuses on the next step to be taken. The CNC is not appointed to decide which of the candidates has been the best archdeacon or parish priest. It's appointed to discover which of the candidates will be the right bishop of the diocese for the next few years. It therefore requires a readiness to receive from God the unexpected leading and the unforeseen gift. This discernment is not a private one, each member making it for him or herself. It's reached collectively by 14 people with a common faith and different experiences. And reaching it is a journey of exploration which none of them knows the end of from the beginning. It requires special gifts, an imagination that can pick up on other people's meanings, a patience that can wait until an obscure picture gets clearer. And those who do this task well know where they come from, they know where they're going, but they are also naturally responsive and cooperative, good at finding a common path where one may not seem to exist. They understand Christian people, they understand the candidates on the one hand, they understand their fellow members of the CNC on the other. 14 members, 6 central members elected from this place, 6 from the diocese, 2 archbishops. They make the decision representatively on behalf of the whole church. They bring a huge range of experiences and contributions with them. They express the perspectives of others beside themselves. They engage imaginatively with the needs of the diocese and the needs of the wider church. For the CNC to represent the church, it's not enough that it should contain just the right balance of women, men, northerners, southerners, ethnic minorities, conservatives, liberals, and so on. It must achieve a communication of perspectives which enables a common path to emerge as the perspectives converge. And for this process to work, it requires trust. Trust of the CNC members in one another, trust of the CNC by the church, and of course, by candidates. On our recommendations, the first thing to be stated is that there is no one thing that goes wrong with the CNC and badly needs putting right. Talking to people about our work over the last 18 months, we have often been told, of course, the whole problem is ... Sometimes the whole problem is that the diocesan members are confused and at sea, or that they're lining up as a phalanx to defend the diocesan point of view. Sometimes the whole problem is the central members, who are skilled political operators with their cards close to their chests. Sometimes the whole problem is the archbishops, possessed, it seems, of an awesome spiritual authority that reduces everybody else to a jelly. It's no one of these things that makes the process sometimes, not always, difficult. It's the combination of a variety of factors, none of which is beyond modest and sensible correction. So we have proposed modestly, and we hope sensibly, first, tackling the culture of excessive secrecy. The work of the CNC has to take place within a surrounding wall of confidentiality. That's essential to trust. But within that surrounding wall, we believe that candor and openness should be helped to prevail as much as possible. Intrusive secrecy undermines trust and creates suspicions. And here we point especially to the secret ballot, which encourages CNC members to wonder what one another are doing. And we point also to the arrangements for interview, where candidates are sometimes smuggled in and out of Lambeth Palace and Bishopthorpe to stop them meeting other candidates. And we want to see an open ballot in which everybody declares how they have voted and, if necessary, explains it. And we want to see the candidates worshipping and eating together with the members of the CNC and each other. Secondly, we are proposing facilitating the contribution of the diocesan members to ensure they're up to speed when the CNC first convenes. The CNC has to work in a tight time schedule. We hope that dioceses will make use of central resources to encourage their vacant CNC committees to take on a role of self-preparation and self-education, so that the members who are elected are well aware of what's going to happen and why it's going to happen when the vacancy arises. Thirdly, we propose giving a distinct voice to the archbishops. The bishops in the church, we believe, have a real role in overseeing the succession of bishops, but that role is not to name their successors. It is to ensure the continuity of episcopal ministry as the church understands it. And in this, we see a part that perhaps needs to be played by the archbishop who is not in the chair at the CNC, speaking for the needs of the episcopate as a whole. And we also propose that the two archbishops should make a statement jointly to the rest of the CNC before it votes, that on the evidence presented, all the candidates under consideration are eligible for consecration, for membership of the House of Bishops, and the doctrine and practice of the Church of England. Fourthly, deepening the representative authenticity of the CNC. We want to encourage some fresh thinking among you, ladies and gentlemen, about how the central members are elected to the CNC. This is no criticism of those who have worked in that role, some of whom have made outstanding contributions to the life of the church, that there is a perception at large that the central members are elected to pursue party agenda. We don't believe most of the time that they do pursue party agenda, but there is a perception which is destructive. If that perception is to change, then I think this body needs to tackle the question of how it elects them in a different way from the way it does now. We have made a few suggestions just to start the juices flowing, but it is up to this body to think seriously about how this body does its business. On the diocesan side, too, there are concerns about representation. Now, it is the stated duty of the Bishop's Council in a diocese to ensure that the vacant CNC committee is representative of the diocese. Now, what that means differs from diocese to diocese, and from year to year, one might say, if anything ever improves. Problems that we face over being representative in a certain way today, I hope we won't be facing in 10 years, but there may be other problems. That is why we've resisted the temptation to try to make general rules, but we do suggest that the Vacant C&C Committee should have a minuted discussion of the representation of the diocese and what it requires before it proceeds to elect the diocesan members. We're also anxious about a tendency of the diocesan administration to dominate C&C representation. We want to see tighter disciplines about that. And then there are special questions about the representative composition of the C&C for the archiepiscopal sees. Our proposals for Canterbury have been broadly in line with others already mooted in this synod. For York, we should like standing orders to secure the convention that the House of Bishops will elect a bishop of the Northern Province to sit on that C&C. We have also suggested changes to the way the lay chair for York is appointed. That's a brief summary of what we've done. Questions will now be answered by my colleagues, by Dr. Jennifer Strawbridge, by Thomas Seville and James Walters. And on the behalf of all the members of the review, I thank the members of the Synod who actively assisted us in our work, and the chairs and the Business Committee for the opportunity to introduce the discussion of this report. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was most interesting and helpful. So, as Professor O'Donovan has said, there is now the opportunity for members to put questions to him, and as he said, he will be assisted by Father Thomas Seville, Reverend Dr. Jennifer Strawbridge, and Reverend Canon Dr. James Walters. Members of Synod, like we have done on previous occasions, I shall take questions in groups of 3. So it would be helpful if, when members are called, to go to one of the podiums in a group of 3, please. I'd also like to take this opportunity of reminding people to ask a question. I'd like to remind you of that fact and encourage you, rather than to make a speech. And please, to keep your question as pithy, as short as possible, and therefore to keep to the point. That'd be most helpful. Thank you. So if you'd like to ask a question, can you please stand? All right, thank you. So, Anne Foreman, would you like to come? And is the other lady standing? Are you Enid Barron? No? Sorry, what's her name? Oh, are you ready to ask your question as well? Can you go to one of the podiums? And you, sorry, I don't know your name. Oh, the Archdeacon of Gloucester, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Anne Foreman, Exeter 308. Thank you very much for this long-awaited report. As someone who's asked several questions about the CNC, I'm very glad to see it. I'm asking my question as the elected member of Exeter Vacant CNC and as someone who has served on 2 separate CNCs as a diocesan rep. I wonder if I could ask you to expand a little bit on paragraph 1.5c, and that is why it's considered that achieving an orderly introduction of women might hide the need for a wide diversity of gifts.
Thank you. The Professor will bear that in mind and his team. So, Enid, would you like to present your question, please? Ask your question.
Enid Barron, 350 London. Mine is a very small point of process, and I sort of hesitate to ask this against the grand sweep of the theological background, but it's important that process is as good as it can be at each level. And I refer to paragraph 511 of the report, that a great deal of attention was given to the process of election, and we're not conscious of a need to revisit it at length. I have just been recently involved in a vacancy in C committee, and I was very upset to find that I could not vote for our members because I would not be present at a particular meeting. And I realise when you're on these committees, you do try to go to every meeting, but my son was getting married in the northwest of Scotland in a remote village, and the meeting was in London on the same day, and I couldn't fix that. I think as most of our elections are carried out by postal vote, not by an immediate vote on the day, I wonder if we could look at the possibility, and if this was something you thought about, of having a postal vote when we vote for our representatives on the CNC. It could well affect the outcome if several members of that diocesan committee are not around, and I think it may well have done in
Excuse
London.
me, please, can we stick to the question?
I am asking a question. I'm merely explaining why I'm asking it, which is that I think it could skew the process if we don't have a postal vote. Thank you.
All right, thank you. And now the Venerable Jackie Searle, please. Thank you.
Jackie Searle, Gloucester 122. Thank you for letting me ask my question, which relates to paragraph 4.6. First of all, thank you very much for this report. I don't always enjoy reading all the Synod papers, but I really enjoyed reading this one and the thought that it has given us. But my question about 4.6 is that little bit at the end about any misunderstanding about lists from diocesan bishops and the Strategic Leadership Development Programme. And I'd like to understand, please, a little more about why that is necessary, what the misunderstanding might be, what lies behind the comment at the end of that paragraph. Thank you.
So, Professor O'Donovan and your team, are you ready to answer, please? Thank you.
Hello, Jennifer Strawbridge. With regards to the first question about expanding on why it is that paragraph 15C talks about the introduction of women to the House of Bishops, hiding the general need for a wider diversity of gifts, that was simply to point out that if we only focus on introducing women into the House of Bishops, it is very easy to miss the other diversities that remain unrepresented within the House. And so it was not meant to be a slight towards the ordination of women as bishops. In terms of the question about the postal vote for vacancy in C committees, part of the report does talk about the introduction, perhaps, of a debate about representation on that committee before the vote is taken. And therefore, a postal vote would mean that the person could not be present for such a debate to realize the wider representation that might be needed within a diocese. And we feel that that representation is very, and a discussion about it is very key before members of vacancy in C are elected to the diocesan central CNC.
Members,
Final question. And just on that final point about the selection of candidates and the Strategic Leadership Development Programme, we were broadly encouraged and supportive of the work of the SLDP and in preparing people for senior leadership. But there is no explicit link that has been made between that programme and the lists that are prepared to consider people for diocesan appointment or indeed as suffragan bishops, and we thought that that's a good thing in order to avoid what we describe as the pyramidal model, in order to fish from the widest pool possible for people considered by Crown Nominations Commissions. And it's in that spirit that we recommend that the House of Bishops as a whole should take collective responsibility for putting people on those lists to avoid good candidates being overlooked by diocesan bishops.
We have time for one more round of questions if anyone has a burning question. Oh, Jamie, Harrison, yes, please, if you'd like to go to the podium. Yes, please, thank you.
Jamie Harrison, Durham 299. Thank you for this very full report. I'm interested in your suggestion at 510 of the election of the 6 central members being so-called in full synod. I wonder whether you were thinking this would still be by houses, or whether you're thinking that it would be the whole mind of the whole synod who would elect 3 members from the House of Laity and 3 members from the House of Clergy.
Yes, please, thank you.
Stephen Linus, Bath and Wells, number 60. This is a question about paragraph 520, and I may have simply misread what you intend. It says about in archiepiscopal vacancies, electing bishops from the various provinces to sit on the CNC. It's not clear to me that you're simply saying these should be existing diocesan bishops, or whether suffragan bishops might adopt that role. Suffragan bishops are sometimes long-serving and often long-suffering, but there are those who may well contribute to this process, but unless I read you incorrectly, they are excluded from being eligible.
Thank you. Sarah Tuplin, 471, representing Deaf Anglicans Together. My question is, that similar to something that somebody asked earlier about women, but I would just like to add a question about equal opportunities, and what about including deaf and disabled people? How would they be involved in this process of election and discernment? I don't necessarily mean that they have to be within the CNC, but there should be some part of the process open to them.
Thank you, everyone, for those questions.
Thank you very much indeed. The idea, the process of election, if it comes open in Synod, those suggestions, I think they were, as Professor O'Donovan said, just to get the juices flowing. One might actually look at electoral different ways of voting. STV serves for some purposes, doesn't serve for CNC's purposes. So yes, there's nothing prescriptive about that. That is, as the report says, over to you for our imagination. Yes, let it flourish. Vacancy C, there's no intention with respect to the bishop elected from the Northern Province to diocesan. It could be a suffragan as well. I think that's in the report. It just needs to be a bishop from the Northern Province. And how would deaf and disabled persons be involved in the process? Well, from somebody who was particularly impressed by the interview I had with deaf and disabled persons, I hope the best way of involving them would be to elect them to be bishops. That is, I think, the best way of involving them in the process.
I understand there are no more questions to be received, so I would just like to thank the Business Committee and the chairs for the opportunity again to present the report and to promise you the prayers and interest of the 8 theologians who worked on the review group as you set about getting your teeth into the tasks that we have set for you. Thank you very much.
So in order for there to be sufficient time for a meaningful debate, that concludes the question time. Thank you to everyone who asked a question. And once again, thank you, Professor O'Donovan and your colleagues for all your contributions this afternoon. That concludes this item of business. Therefore, we'll now move straight on to the next item on the agenda, item 4, which is a take-note debate on Discerning in Obedience, a theological review of the Crown Nominations Commission, which is GS MISC 2080. Members will need that document. And also, I'd like to draw your attention to the green 6th notice paper, which has a financial comment for our awareness. Thank you. I'd like to invite the Archbishop of York, John Centimove, to move item 4. You have up to 10 minutes. Thank you.
Madam Chair, thank you. Before I speak, we had intended to welcome the Bishop of Sheffield for the first time. We welcome you, Pete. So, Madam Chair, I hope the clock starts now. Now then, beloved in Christ, we come to the take-note debate. My first duty, indeed, and joy is to thank Professor Oliver O'Donovan and the rest of the team for the time they dedicated to this review and for the depth of the insights they have provided. Their work graciously demands of all of us, not because it's Holy Writ, but because of its theological and moral weight, to hear it, read it, mark it, learn it, and inwardly and patiently digest its message, to borrow words of 1662 collect for the second Sunday in Advent. Why? So that we may discern in obedience the nomination of bishops in the Church of England. Because as the Church of England, by law established, and is both Catholic and Reformed, the nomination of its chief pastors requires wisdom and insight and cannot be taken lightly. It can only be realized by walking in the new and living way which Christ has opened for us through the curtain, the way of his flesh. Archbishop Justin and I were confident that to approach this as a theological rather than a process review would draw out riches for us. Indeed, it has. And we have before us a report which will be foundational to the way in which we think about discernment in the many areas of the life of the Church of England, and for that matter, in the Anglican Communion, and we are very grateful that 3 primates of 3 provinces are here with us. In addition, we do not often get the opportunity to thank those who serve as members of the Commission, central and diocesan, so I'd like to do so now. This is a costly calling, and this report reminds us of the complexities involved. Commission members carry the hopes and aspirations of many, as well as the tensions of the wider Church of England as they ponder and pray over, say, the next Bishop of Bristol or Truro. And over the last 12 years, I have seen how the Crown Nominations Commission carry out this responsibility, and I want to pass on my gratitude. Many issues have been raised in the previous discussion, and I'd like to start by drawing out some of these themes that have actually resonated with me. So forgive me if I repeat some of the words that you heard from Professor O'Donovan. But a vote will be taken at the end of this take-note debate. I will then set out how we ought to progress the recommendations. The report notes at paragraph 1.7, painful points of pressure on current operations. We are committed to addressing this, some in the short term and some in the longer term. And the comments and ideas of Synod members will be listened to carefully by the various bodies we are suggesting to take the proposals forward. Firstly, let us turn to the challenge posed to us around discernment, a word we use so often, and I quote, "Discernment involves a step of faith, enabling us to conceive something that God will bring about which is not yet objectively visible. In order to reach a discernment, it is essential not to try to know the end from the beginning. If we do so, and they say, we are likely to miss what God intends us to see. Secondly, vocation, and a reminder that the calling of the church and the calling of the individual rest together if vocation is to be fulfilled. Again, I quote, the call of God is proved by a convergence of the judgment of the nominators, in this case the Crown Nominations Commission, with a personal conviction of vocation on the part of the nominee. Thirdly, trust. If the candidates are to have trust in the Crown Nominations Commission, members of the Commission must also have trust in one another. Fourthly, diversity. To represent others is to be trusted by those who share an angle of vision and to commend that vision to those who have other angles. And I'm sure I'm not alone in being alert to the possibilities of these reflections, indeed should have for us in the wider life of the church. We should also note the reflections on the oversight role of the bishop, which demands of them to lead with insight and wisdom, with a willingness to challenge and to be challenged, a willingness to change and to foster change. So the significance of theological culture, holding together spiritual and administrative gifts, preparation for the gift of leadership, the exploration of the roles of archbishops, central and diocesan members, and secretarial support, and the processes of discerning and deciding and voting arrangements. I'm sure that members will wish to comment further on this in the debate. So now I turn to the implementation of the recommendations. Members of Synod will be aware that a number of Crown Nominations Commission related issues have come together. Sir Philip Moore made some suggestions about process in his recent review of the Sheffield Crown Nominations Commission. Oxford Diocesan Synod has proposed a motion inviting the archbishops to initiate a review into the role of the Crown Nominations Commission. And the Archbishops' Council have been invited by the Diocese of Canterbury to consider proposals to enable Synod to extend the functions of the Crown Nominations Commission to include the See of Dover, and also to reduce the number of diocesan members elected to the Commission when it considers a vacancy in the See of Canterbury. Now, this latter piece of work will require a cool head and a compassionate heart review before consideration by the Synod, and the Secretary General will need to liaise with both the diocese and the wider Anglican Communion to develop proposals. With regard to the Oxford motion, Professor O'Donovan's group have reviewed different methods of appointment around the Anglican Communion. It is reassuring that the group concludes, our view of the overall structure of the Crown Nominations Commission is positive. It is capable of serving the Church well, noting that it rests on responsible theological grounds. It may be that the Synod would wish to revisit this issue, or whether or not to have a wider review at some stage. However, at this stage, the Archbishop of Canterbury and I are proposed to focus on the recommendations of discerning in obedience and to implement them through existing bodies and committees. We believe that this will be an effective way to bring about the changes identified. The annex to GS 2080 draws together the recommendations of Sir Philip Moore Review and of the report Discerning and in Obedience we are actually discussing today. So it sets out very clearly the areas that each group will be asked to progress, and also proposes an oversight from General Synod to monitor the progress itself. So to give you the idea on timing, the central members of the Crown Nominations Commission meet in March and will consider the various issues set out in the paper at its meeting. You'll also note that some of the recommendations from the Sir Philip Moore Review have already been put in place. So this afternoon, I would like to invite members of Synod to share their reflections, theological and practical, on this report. And I welcome additional ideas and suggestions from the floor, which I will refer to the working groups identified. So speaking on behalf of those of us who serve as permanent members of the Crown Nominations Commission, the Archbishop of Canterbury and I, the two appointment secretaries, will report back to you in July following a meeting of central members in March. And so, Synod, I invite you to take note of this report, Discerning in Obedience, a theological review of the Crown Nominations Commission. Chair, I beg to move the motion standing in my name. Thank you.
Thank you. I now put item 4 before members of Synod for debate. I'm going to impose a 3-minute speech limit from the beginning due to the number of people wishing to contribute to this debate. As I say, item 4 is now open for debate. I call upon the Reverend Dr. David Eisen, followed by Mr. Anthony Archer. Thank you.
David Eisen, Deans 54. Chair, may I commend and congratulate the review group on its excellent report, very thoughtful, very helpful. I just wanted to make one suggestion coming out of the experience of chairing the Diocese of London Vacancy in C Committee last year. In paragraph 512, the report notes the failure of our process to elect a BAME member of the CNC. That was despite the fact the Bishop's Council had co-opted 4 BAME young people onto the Vacancy in C Committee at the outset in order to give greater representation. And the report goes on to state correctly there's no explicit responsibility given to the Vacancy in C Committee to ensure a representative group of CNC members. However, the report then makes, I think, a rather weak recommendation that we should hold a minuted discussion of what's required for good representation before receiving nominations for the election, and then suggests if this doesn't work, then perhaps the election could be overturned. I don't think that's good enough. The reason for the failure of the London CNC to elect even one BAME member of the CNC, sorry, the London Vacancy in C Committee, was not because we hadn't discussed the importance of this. It was because when 51 people are voting, they will put first what they think is most important for them and think that someone else will sort the rest out. And the voting showed that the reality was the majority of members of the Vacancy in C Committee held as most important either a particular theological position or the representation of women, and did not actually think that BAME representation was necessary or important enough to make it the main priority to vote for. And it's not easy for members of a large Vacancy in C Committee to trust each other enough to be honest about what they really think, nor is it easy for a committee member who has been elected to represent one of the different groups in the diocese to let go of that representation in order to take on something else, however important it may be for the diocese and the wider church as a whole. I would therefore suggest that provision be made to take mere discussion about good CNC representation to the level of decision, by giving the option for Vacancy in C Committee to designate one reserved place in the election of CNC members on the basis of a criterion determined by the Diocesan Statement of Needs, subject to the agreement of the Bishop's Council and of the Archbishop of the province, in order to avoid this being used unnecessarily or perhaps abused. And this would require the Vacancy in C Committee to decide as well as discuss and face its responsibility to offer a balanced representation of the diocese to the CNC process.
Thank you. After Anthony Archer, I'd like to invite April Alexandra to speak, please. Thank you.
Archer, 393 St Albans. Madam Chair, I want to add my voice in welcoming the report Discerning in Obedience and thanking Professor O'Donovan and his distinguished team for their work. We might have expected the theology to be of the first rank, but what struck me was the fact that the report is also practical. It gets under the skin of the whole important process. It is applied theology. I declare an interest as a current member of the CNC and indeed a past member. I should add that I've now been a member myself of 8 CNCs, and my experience throughout has been very positive. The CNCs that I've been privileged to be part of have worked as one body. But despite that, Madam Chair, I'm not proud to be associated with a body that has a reputation for being secretive. And the secrecy, as the report notes, can be overbearing and excessive. It is secrecy within and without. And it is, I think, both cultural and institutional. And culture change is not always easy to effect. I want to pick up on just two recommendations in the report that the professor focused on in his presentation. The first concerns how the CNC works. The standing orders, as you know, require voting by secret ballot. We need to learn anything from Professor O'Donovan's extensive and helpful discussion on discernment, then it must be the case that all our deliberations in the CNC are open. It is very concerning that there appears to be some evidence that there's been voting in some recent CNCs which does not reflect the underlying discussion. All members of the Commission must be required to declare how they intend to vote and why, including the archbishops, although they might be permitted to declare their hand last. The second concerns how central members are elected. A leaflet with 100 words against each candidate is simply not enough. The electorate really need to know who the candidates are and where they stand on key issues. Importantly, for example, the 5 guiding principles. We do elections like this in the House of Laity, have open hustings, and I want to affirm that as a way forward. Madam Chair, the twin principles the CNC works to are transparency of process, yet confidentiality of deliberation. Unfortunately, confidentiality of deliberation principles seem to dominate all proceedings. There isn't time to unpack this. I believe the Church needs to recover confidence in the CNC process, and individual CNC members need to have more confidence in each other. The work programme set by GS 2080 in its Annex 1 is to be welcomed. So in closing, I urge Synod strongly to take note of GS 2080 and urge all CNC stakeholders, frankly that's all of us, to engage with what will be much needed culture and procedural change going forward. Thank you.
Is he? After April Alexander, I'd like to ask Jonathan Alderton-Ford to speak, please. Thank you.
April Alexander, Southwark 410. I was a member until last July of the Central CNC, and I did not stand for re-election. I am a member of Watch. It's very welcome to have this opportunity to discuss the work of the Crown Nominations Commission. I'm very grateful to the whole group for their work and for this close look at the processes of the CNC, which is long overdue. I shall take note of the report, encourage others to do the same, and I fully support all the proposals that are made in it. However, in one major respect, this report is a disappointment. The group was commissioned to do this work in the wake of the failure of a particular CNC to appoint, and this is described in para 6.9 in really some detail, and I will quote it. Out of the 14 voting members, a 2/3 majority requires 10, which is a high threshold. If that is not reached, deadlock can be only resolved if one or more supporters of the runner-up transfers support to the leading candidate. A special case of the same problem arises when one or more members find themselves unable to support either of the final 2 candidates. Failing a concession on someone's part, the CNC must begin again from the beginning. In the case in question, these 2 final candidates were distinguished, very widely respected and admired, and enthusiastically supported by many in the CNC, but still some members were, and I quote, unable to support either of them. There are no prizes for guessing the reason. Here we have the nub of the problems which have beset the CNC over the years since the Women Bishops measure, and it explains why so few women have been nominated. It is not necessary for me to name the wonderfully gifted women who have not emerged from the grueling process described in Section 6, and others who have not even wished their names to go forward. You know them. Now we have, in my time, 2 dioceses came fully open to new possibilities, and they have been richly rewarded, as have we all. Now we have a 3rd woman diocesan, all the more welcome because so unexpected, as Harriet Sherwood reported in The Guardian only the week before. Maybe there was the concession, I quote, on somebody's part, of which the report speaks. The answer to our problem lies in Principle 1. The Church of England is fully and unequivocally committed to all orders of ministry being open to all without reference to gender. I can assure the Synod that in my experience, reference to gender was only articulated in one case and was very quickly ruled out of order. Despite this, I am fully convinced that in none of those nominations in which I participated were individuals considered without reference to gender.
Thank you. After Jonathan Alderson-Ford, I invite the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, to speak. Thank you.
Jonathan Alderson-Ford, St Edmundsbury, Ipswich, 207. Thank you, Chair, for calling me on such a congested day. It is with a heavy heart that I'm going to vote against this report, and there are three reasons. Firstly, many of our diocesan bishops, worthy men and women as they are, there seems to be a preponderance of people who have done the job first as suffragans. And the process by which you become a suffragan, the best will in the world, is less rigorous than the way we choose diocesans. So it should be. But it does mean that this report has put a great deal of emphasis on discerning the individual. And that means that I think it's lost sight of the fact that each diocese is different, and each diocesan bishop is there for a particular time, never to be repeated. It has been right to express concern about the influence of the diocesan members. But the diocesan members have to live with the consequences of a poor decision in a way that the other members don't. And that's why sometimes they can be quite prickly when they go to these events, understandably so. The other thing that causes concern for me is that we don't give proper understanding in this report to the state the Church of England is now. It may well be that you have to choose a diocesan bishop who is going to wind up a diocese. It may be a point by which no longer that particular part of the country is well served by the structures that form a diocese. And it is not a thing to rejoice over, but the quality and character of the person you want should be for a particular time and particular services. But perhaps the thing that amazes me most about this report is the desire to end secrecy. My opinion, being on this place for 21 years, is that the CNC has a reputation for leaking like a sieve. And in the many outrageous gossips, there is a grain of truth that some people, once put in bishops' robes, have been very unhappy people. Thank you.
Thank you. After the Archbishop of Canterbury has spoken, Caroline Spellman, would you like to speak, please? Thank you.
Justin Welby, Canterbury 1. I'd like to add my thanks to all those, particularly Professor O'Donovan, but all those who worked with him on the preparation of this report, and the Church House staff and the appointment secretaries. It's a wonderful report, and I can say that in the CNCs we've had since its publication, we have benefited greatly from the way it has spoken. We've used it and particularly emphasized the lucid and quite powerful and moving words on discernment, and they've made a significant difference. So I'm deeply grateful. I'd also want to thank members of CNCs, both diocesan and central members, who give up huge amounts of time and often huge chunks of holiday in order to participate. And we do owe them a great debt. I hope that the Synod will take note of this report with some enthusiasm. The only question I want to raise is one that will not affect me in any way, which is the provision for the election sooner or later of the next Archbishop of Canterbury, should such be necessary. At the moment, the report sets out, and I have spoken to Professor O'Donovan about what I'm going to say. At the moment, the report sets out that it suggests that we should end up with a CNC of 12 for Canterbury and 15 for York. That happens because the suggestion is that Canterbury was 16 when I had the great privilege of being interviewed by the 16 plus the Secretary General, 17 people in one interview. If you take 4 off from the diocesan members to bring them down to the suggested 1 lay and 1 ordained, you get to 12. The problem, though, I think goes a little further than that with Canterbury, which is that it doesn't at the moment reflect the full balance of the Anglican Communion. And the work of the Archbishop in the Anglican Communion is quite demanding and quite extensive. So the representative of the 84 million other members of the Anglican Communion, about 90% from the Global South, when I was interviewed, was the Archbishop of Wales, who is a wonderful man and did a wonderful job as Archbishop of Wales, but may not have entirely represented the Global South. My suggestion has been that the 4 that we lose from the Canterbury Diocesan 6 should be replaced by primates, 1 primate from each of the regions of the Anglican Communion. There are conveniently 5, so with 1 existing plus 4 more, you'd end up with 5 primates elected by, from each of the regions, and you would have a balanced and diverse representation of the entire communion. Apart from that relatively rare occasion, and by the way, the Canterbury CNC, I very strongly, for the Bishop of Dover, I very strongly welcome the suggestion there that that should be a CNC process, given that the Bishop of Dover is, to all intents and purposes, the diocesan bishop for almost all the time, except when the Archbishop clutters up the territory, which he tries to do as little as possible. Thank you.
Thank you. After Caroline Spellman, I invite Nick Land to speak, please. Thank you.
Caroline Spellman, ex officio 458. Firstly, I'd like to add my thanks to the review group for their work and welcome what the Archbishop of Canterbury has just said, that their work is already having a positive impact. As second Church Estates Commissioner, I'm often asked in Parliament about the progress the Church is making to improve the diversity of its clergy, specifically those in senior leadership. In fact, at my most recent question time on the floor of the House, Mr. Speaker took the unusual step of intervening following my answer on diversity of the clergy, urging the Church to, as he said, get on with it. The Church is certainly not the only institution grappling with this issue. In Parliament, we've made some progress. 32% of all MPs are now female. That's a record high. But that is in the year of the centenary of women's suffrage, so we still have a way to go. While I welcome the recent appointments of the Bishop of London, Loughborough and Woolwich, it's clear the CNC has got more work to do in enabling the Church to truly reflect the diversity of the people it serves. Now, I recognise the challenges highlighted in the report about balancing representation of the committee, but I feel the CNC must go further than training recognisable unconscious bias. Ensuring the Church is a diverse body must be a key consideration for the CNC at all stages of the appointment process, because fundamentally people want to see people like themselves in leadership. It's a well-known organisational fact that diversity improves decision-making, and surely the Church, which has a gospel imperative for inclusion, should do even more to lead by example in promoting diversity in its leadership. There is already a degree of positive discrimination to enable women to join the Lord's Spiritual in the House of Lords, and within political parties, we've used a range of measures of positive discrimination, otherwise we wouldn't have got where we are today. Crucially for the Church, the gender balance of ordinands is now very good, meaning parity is attainable in theory, though work is still needed on encouraging vocations from black, minority, ethnic and other diverse backgrounds. So listening carefully to the presentation of this report, The important point, I thought, was the convergence of perspectives and a process which is more open and transparent, which will be absolutely key. We live in a world which is mistrustful of secrecy, and a new culture of openness will not only assist discernment, but inspire greater trust. As the Archbishop of York said, we can miss what God intends us to see. My hope is that these recommendations will improve our vision.
Thank you. After Nick Land, I invite the gentleman on the back row, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Land, York 438. I welcome this report and would like to comment on three areas: theological expertise, leadership, and lay involvement. Many of us reflecting on last summer's synod did wonder where the theological underpinning to our decision-making was. This report helpfully talks about theology being an air we all need to breathe. This is true in synod, in our churches, and in our bishops. It is crucial that the bishop is a skilled, faithful, and articulate proclaimer and interpreter of the biblical and apostolic tradition, and it is right to place a very high value on prospective bishops' theological skills as part of the discernment process. This report also helpfully makes observations about the unique leadership skills required of a diocesan bishop. It is not easy to be both a Christ-like model of servant leadership and to be an effective leader of leaders. But this is what we need. I wonder whether the requirement for a diocesan bishop who can both lead, disciple, and care for other leaders, and where appropriate be led by them, is sufficiently weighted and reflected in the current implementation plan. Finally, lay involvement. As chair of the York Vacancy and See Committee, I welcome the York-specific proposals. I also welcome the proposal to strengthen the authority of lay chairs of archiepiscopal CNCs. I think it's fair to say that slavish deference to lay opinion is not one of the besetting sins of the Church of England. It's certainly not a big problem for us in the Diocese of York. So it is important that laity are supported and empowered to be effective chairs of the discernment process. Thank you very much.
After this gentleman, I'd like to ask the Bishop of Leeds, Nick Baines, to speak, please. Thank you.
Chair, Mike Todd, Truro 423. I speak with particular reference to section 6.1, 6.2 of MIS 1171 and page 12 of GS 280, which refer to the interviewing of candidates. I myself have been interviewing and appointing staff since the mid-1970s in a wide variety of contexts, from the secular, from my own business, in the charitable sector, in church sectors, including both ecumenical and the Church of England, at all levels, at least at this stage, up to the level of dean. But now I find myself a member of the Truro CNC, so it may well be, since we are only just starting our work, that my comments in 6 months' time may be a bit different. Over that period of experience, I've seen the growth of highly structured panel interviewing with lots of pre-prepared, indeed over-prepared questions, which leave little time for follow-up. In my experience, I have found that the larger the panel, the weaker the interview. There is a lack of depth, and furthermore, any even half-decent candidate is able to guess the majority of the questions and themselves come with prepared answers. The similarity with PMQs just along the road can be quite striking at times. This approach can sometimes work quite well when you're appointing from a wide range of broadly similar candidates to a post which is very well defined. But when you're in a situation of wanting to be much more people-centred, to look at the skill sets that are available to you, not the skill sets that you would like to have, the skill sets available, to select between those and allow that skill set to define the job just as much as the other way around. I urge that we begin to look at alternative ways of doing interviewing which allow us to examine the candidates and their skills in as much depth as possible. I'm sure there are many ways of doing this. One might, for example, be to have a number of sub-panels, each of which looks at a particular area. Overall, Madam Chairman, I find the report not only very interesting in general, but as informative as somebody just entering into the process for the first time.
Thank you, Mike Todd. After the Bishop of Leeds, I'd like to invite Lindsay Newcombe to speak, please. Thank you.
Nick Baines, Bishop of Leeds, number 22. I speak only because I think there's an omission in the report, which probably isn't going to be brought up in the context of the debate. But I would like it considered before then, if necessary, being dismissed. I was a member of the Perry Commission that reported in 2002 with its report Working with the Spirit. And within that report, we took seriously the notion of nolo episcopari. That is, that someone might be called to be a bishop who doesn't want to be, and certainly won't put him or herself forward to be so. And the church, we said, needs to have a facility to be able to discern the calling of God and call that person, even if they don't want it. It's something to do with discipleship and obedience. Now, what we've ended up with, and I was the first diocesan bishop appointed after interview, is a system that assumes that all the candidates are burning for the job. What is spoken of in terms of discernment actually is competitive. Now, if we want to stick with that road, that's absolutely fine. Of course, it's reasonable to expect that anybody being interviewed for a post such as a diocesan bishop ought to have some vision for what they're being asked to do. But I just wonder if we've lost something along the way, and if it might be considered by the group going forward as to how we provide the space or make the space for the possibility of the Holy Spirit wanting to call someone to a post, whereas at the moment the most we can do is say the Holy Spirit is calling you to come for an interview. And if you say no, or you don't want it and therefore are not going to perform competitively at interview, you have ruled something out that the church might have benefited from.
After Lindsay Newcombe has spoken, I invite Aidan Hargreaves-Smith to speak, please. Thank you.
Lindsay Newcombe, London 357. Thank you, Madam Chair. Yesterday, the House of Bishops published its official response to the Independent Reviewer's report on the See of Sheffield. In it, it is noted that not nearly enough was done to create an understanding of what the declaration and settlement would mean in practice. It reports that a group has been set up to implement the independent reviewer's recommendation, to form a group to review what has been done and inform and educate clergy and laity of the 2014 settlement. This is a fortuitous moment to do this work when we are assessing the CNC, since the work of the CNC is key to realizing some of the aspirations of the House of Bishops Declaration. The House of Bishops Declaration contains instructions for the CNC at various points, and so the CNC is and will continue to be required to have regard to it and to work to it. It's now the case that candidates for ordination formally assent to the House of Bishops' declaration, including the 5 guiding principles. And it is fitting that those who have the role of discerning our future bishops are also expected to assent to the settlement. I refer to paragraph 5.1 in the theological report. Its discernment will have validity for the whole Church to the extent that it is reached by bringing together diverse perspectives representative of the life of the Church. And I suggest that this is most effectively done in a situation where each member of the gathered group has assented to our contemporary statement of theological diversity and assented to the House of Bishops' declaration and the 5 guiding principles within.
After Aidan Hargreave-Smith has spoken, I invite Andrea Minchicelli-Williams to speak, please. Thank you.
Aidan Hargreave-Smith, London 355. Chair, I'm grateful for the opportunity to thank the review group for its thoughtful work, and I warmly welcome both the theological review and, broadly, the proposals contained in GS 2080. The report emphatically reminds us that choosing a bishop is a process of mutual discernment under God, not simply another competitive recruitment process. How we properly honour that process is the challenge to the Church. Over the past 10 years, that's 40 episcopal nominations, part of my preparation for each CNC meeting was to reread the words of the ordinal for the ordination and consecration of a bishop. I never tired of them, and whilst I welcome the proposed use of the Veni Creator at key moments in the process, I would suggest that parts of the ordinal might also be incorporated, providing as it does a description of episcopal ministry far richer than any role specification produced by a committee. The review group poses the challenge to the CNC to consider how well a candidate has acquired a theological culture and to what extent he or she is an articulate interpreter of the apostolic tradition. This must be fundamental to the work of the Commission, so it will be essential to ensure that CNC members are equipped and resourced to identify such characteristics. As a very late convert to interviews, I remain concerned at the risk that CNC members weigh them more heavily than the other relevant material. The very advantages of the interview are also the factors which risk leading to the interview becoming determinative, and the Commission will need to be careful to avoid that. The review group perceptively notes that the impression can be created that a bishop must be everything anyone else can be. In process terms, this leads to the risk that the Commission produces a long list of characteristics with equally sized boxes, and a candidate prefers a candidate who can place a little tick in every one, rather than varying the size of the boxes according to priorities and significance, and being willing to consider seriously the candidates who may not tick every box, but have a whopping great tick in 1 or 2. This may be the reason why there is a paucity of academic theologians on the bench, and a factor in why the House of Bishops is not as diverse as it should be. There are many references throughout the report, both to diversity and to the importance of that diversity in the representational balance of the CNC's membership. For me, therefore, it is a little disappointing that there is no suggestion as to how the deliberations of the CNC might benefit from important perspectives not present amongst its membership. This is not simply an issue about inclusion, but of the credibility of the CNC's processes and decisions. And given the Church's frankly appalling record on fostering diversity in senior appointments, we've gone backwards in all but one category identified in talent and calling endorsed by this synod 10 years ago. This is embarrassingly urgent business. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm getting conscious of the time, so after Andrea, I'm going to invite Andrew Nunn to speak, please, and then I will be looking for a motion of closure on this debate, please. Thank you.
Andrea Minichiello Williams, Chichester 286. Thank you to the Professor and the committee for this report. I rose to speak in this debate after the speeches of April Alexander and Caroline Spellman, because there was the mention, as there has been running throughout this debate, the gospel imperative for inclusion and positive discrimination. The gospel imperative, of course, is found at the heart of this report. It's mentioned in the title of the report, how to discern in obedience and to look at a strong theological review of how the Crown Nomination Commission functions. We find that well set out on pages 14 and 15 of the report. In paragraph 3.9, this is what is written. What we look to find in a bishop is the arc of a mature and compelling life of faithfulness to the gospel, the life above reproach that will represent the transforming power of the gospel to many outside the church who know nothing else of it, being well thought out of by outsiders, referring then to 1 Timothy 3:7, in which we see Paul who imitated Christ. And then in paragraph 3.10, the episcopate has the responsibility of guarding the church's tradition of teaching, and almost all the questions that come before it for discussion have some doctrinal features, even if they are not all primarily doctrinal questions, which of course is what David Banting was mentioning during the business debate earlier today. And so a big decision in this review, as we look at the Crown Nomination Commission's functions, is this: how will we, as the Church of Christ, the bride that speaks to this nation, ensure that we do not have appointed as bishops those who are openly flouting the teaching of the Bible and the unvarying teaching of the church down the ages? This is the gospel imperative of the Crown Nomination Commission.
Thank you. As I said, after Andrew Nunn, I am looking for a motion of closure, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Andrew Nunn, Deans 55. I was for 8 years a member of the CNC, and it's lovely to see so many bright, shining faces of some of the bishops that I was interviewing. I have to say that I never turned to jelly in the presence of the archbishops, but that's one of the thankful things. It was a huge privilege to be involved. I'm wearing my red cross today, which I never did at a meeting of the CNC. We're a very tribal organisation, and we know that. We're elected, we stand on certain principles. But the thing that always annoyed me more than anything else was the fact when people wouldn't leave their tribal branding at the door, but brought that in. This, above all, the CNC, is a process of discernment and listening. And we can only do that discernment and listening when we switch off the radio waves of our own tribe that are playing in our ears. We're not there to form the church in our own image, but to form the church in Christ's image. And that will be different in each diocese. And so I would encourage whatever process is in the future, particularly for the election of central members of the CNC, but to discern people who are able to leave highly held views at the door, but instead to be open to the promptings of the Spirit for the future of the church. And I think in that way we'll achieve the very best people, a very diverse group of people on the bench of bishops for the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Freeman, John Freeman. Thank you. That has my consent. Does it have the consent of Synod? Those in favour, please show. Thank you. And those against, please show. Thank you. So to close the debate, that is clearly carried. Thank you. I invite the Archbishop of York to respond to the debate. You have up to 5 minutes, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Members of Synod, there are quite a number still standing and wishing to speak. We will benefit if what you are going to say has been written, and please hand it into the Clerk of Synod, because we would love to hear all the views that could have been expressed. To Dr. David Ison about BME representation, he wants it slightly tougher. All I can say, we listened to your argument, and I hope you are challenging not only the CNC, but the rest of all the appointment processes in the Church of England. He was elected to represent London, and because the diocesan CNC had failed to have a mandatory ethnic Anglican person on it, instead he stepped down and somebody stood in his place who was from that particular ethnic group. So he's speaking with conviction, and as the suffragette said, not words, action, actions, actions. So that's what really we need, because this is, for me, is what I want to call a spiritual problem which we need as a church to address. So what you're suggesting will be looked at. We'll find a way maybe of doing it, maybe not in the way you want, but actually you are raising a spiritual problem for the rest of the Church of England, not just the CNC. To Anton Archer, yes, secrecy. In fact, the review group don't want this to continue happening in that way. And I personally, and I'm sure Canterbury would welcome this, a question of, yes, when you gather your processes, don't need to be secret, but confidentiality in terms of deliberation, because we're talking about people and human beings. And I think what they're suggesting, again, we take it very seriously in GS 2080. To April Alexander, I'm glad you're going to take note of the report. You raise a number of concerns. And again, I want to suggest that since in Christ there is now therefore no male, female, slave or free, but all are one in Christ, that will permeate the way we actually do our business and look at other people. And to Jonathan Anderson Ford, how do we balance the relationship between the diocese, the Church of England, the Anglican Communion, and the world? And so when you're appointing a bishop, it's not just for that diocese. They are going to be a member of the House of Bishops. Therefore, they have got responsibility nationally as well as internationally, and more so in the Anglican Communion. So I hope this calling in place and time, again, is taken on seriously by the review group. Whom am I to speak about Canterbury? Because we heard from the Archbishop Justin suggesting 5 primates from the Anglican Communion. Again, this is a matter which is going to be reviewing this, need to look at it and come up with, again, some suggestions which may help, because, again, the issue has got to be whoever is chosen as Archbishop of Canterbury as Primate of all England Metropolitan has got to have within that particular nomination not just the Anglican Communion dimension, but actually a national role as well. So that needs to be balanced out properly so that we do not think we are simply getting somebody who's just more burdened by the Anglican Communion. Nevertheless, that's still quite an important thing. To Caroline Spellman, diversity of clergy. What is critical for me, again, like with David Ison, we need to be more transparent and open to the work of the Spirit. And when that doesn't happen, friend, you can have bodies and places, but actually they don't change things. To Dr. Land, in terms of theological underpinning, effective leadership, and lay involvement, yeah, you are quite right. In York, that happens. To Michael Todd, yeah, the body may be large, but they don't all have to ask questions. In fact, the present practice in the Prime Minister's Commission, people pair up, and about half of the commission ask the questions. The rest of us are discerning in terms of listening. Listening is just as important as the question you put. So I hope that actually will help, because the body is big doesn't mean everybody asks a question, and you're quite right. If everybody asks a question, the depth won't be there, but the rest of us try to discern. Well, to the Bishop of Leeds, yeah, pray for the unwilling to become willing. They can only do that if the Holy Spirit is also speaking to them. And to Lindsay Newcomb, the House of Bishop declaration, you'll be glad to know that at the beginning of each commission meeting, at the beginning of the commission, everybody must affirm that they accept the 5 guiding principles. And if they do not, then friends, I think the chair of the CNC for that particular vacancy may have to have conversations on whether they can continue to serve. So I actually think the discipline is already there. Aidan, you were on the central membership of the Crown Office Commission for 10 years. You're one of those people that I know read all the papers. And not only, you also committed yourself not to do anything which was not about discernment. And for that, again, we're very careful. Certainly, the ordinal, I can see its part. And again, you'd be glad to know that part of the requirements that are put on the mandatory bits of it, matters come out of that ordinal now. So the thing is slightly improved after you're always reminding us that, please, we are not having a beauty parade. Interviews are important, but actually they should not overweigh the rest of the documents we've got. Now to Andrea Williams, in responding both to the contribution by Alexandra and the State SS Commissioner asking about how do we know whether these bishops are going to do this? Well, paragraph 5.5 of the report, they talk about the Archbishop should make a formal declaration that on the evidence presented to the CNC, all candidates under consideration are eligible for consecration in accordance with the teaching of the Church and the guidance given by the House of Bishops, and no eligible for membership, rather be also eligible for membership of the House. So for all of us, I think if that did happen, in fact it already happens in many ways, but I think that probably will answer, and of course it will require also members of the Crown Nomination Commission to ask what I call intelligent question, that will list, but I think this business of the declaration by the archbishops will be very, very helpful. And so if there's a thing I didn't answer, I'm very sorry, but the rest of you, may God bless you. Thank you. I hope you'll take note of this, report.
Thank you. Members of Synod, we move to vote on item 4, Discerning in Obedience, a theological review of the Crown Nominations Commission. Those in favour, please show. Thank you. Those against, please show. Thank you. Therefore, item 4, the theological review of the CNC, is clearly carried. Thank you to everyone who's contributed to the debate. Thank you very much. We will now move to the next item of business, which is questions. Thank you.
Yes, agreed.
Mine looks like
Is there central control set up?
Synod, we now come to the next item on our agenda, the ever-popular question time. It's good to see you all here. One or two reminders about the rules for the questions. We do have about 90 questions this afternoon. We may not get through all of them, but I think to do justice to those who have put the questions, I'd like to get as far through that as we possibly can. Can remind, therefore, those who ask supplementaries that they are meant to be supplementary to the original question and answer, and that they should be questions, not statements. How long does a supplementary last? Depending on what sort of Anglican you are, I think a supplementary question, if it lasted about the length of a Hail Mary, 8 bars of a praise chorus, or the Collect for Purity from the BCP, that would probably be about enough to allow us to get through all the questions tonight. Thank you. It's not in order in asking a supplementary question to criticise any particular person or body. The questions are to seek information, not to allow you to critique other people or church bodies. We come now to the question number 1, to the Church Commissioners, and her debut on stage, the first Church Estates Commissioner will reply.
Supplementary.
Supplementary.
Susie Leaf, Truro 421. As people don't have the answer in front of them, can I have 10 more bars or 3 more bars?
Go on, go on.
Well, can I first say thank you both to those who collated this information. There's many pages of it. Thank you, and for their efforts to ensure the work of the Church of England is funded so generously. My question is one of value for money. These figures show that over the past 4 years, you've spent almost twice as much on the ministry of our bishops and key cathedral staff, without taking into account housing costs, as you have spent on the much publicised strategic development grants. Now, without wishing to say that our bishops or our cathedral staff are not strategic in any way, noting there is a robust monitoring and evaluation scheme for those who receive strategic development funding, what plans do the Church Commissioners have for ensuring similar value for money from their other greater investments?
Well, I'm very grateful for the question, and also to those who collated the data, and delighted to join you in Synod as the new first Church Estates Commissioner. Thank you very much. I'm so grateful for your prayers, everyone who's offered them. And if you haven't offered them, please do pray for me anyway. I think it's absolutely brilliant that we have this new stream of strategic development funding. Don't forget that the commissioners are over-distributing, spending more than the actuaries are telling us that we can really afford in the short term, because the commissioners believe wholeheartedly that every person should have the chance to grasp how wide and long and high and deep is the love of Jesus Christ. This is our driving mission, and we're so grateful to have the chance to support the church in it. We are an episcopally led church, and we do need properly to support our bishops. We are, in fact, talking to them one by one at the moment about the block grants that they get, to make sure that those are fairly paid, because actually they're rooted in a lot of historic practice, and we do need to make sure that that's fairly distributed. When it comes to cathedrals, I commend to you the draft cathedrals report. That, in fact, sort of suggests that the commissioners aren't quite spending enough on cathedrals rather than too much. And we will be responding to that report after our next board meeting and deciding how best to respond to the finalised report after the consultation period. We absolutely agree with you that we do need value. But we need to work together with our colleagues in Archbishop's Council and with all of you to ensure that we all do our very best with the great resources that are at our disposal. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Questions 2 and 3 are to the Chair of the Pensions Board, Dr. Jonathan Spencer, to answer. Question 2. No. Question 3. Yes?
Catherine Grells, Birmingham, 63.
Thank you for your answer and for the openness to hear the views of stakeholders. What is the best mechanism by which stakeholders can respond to that invitation?
So by which stakeholders can respond to?
Your openness to hear the views of the stakeholders on ethical concerns, particularly climate change.
Well, when we were at the Pensions Board and the other national investing bodies rely heavily on the work of the Ethical Investment Advisory Group for policy development. In the course of developing new or updated policies on ethical matters, they will typically consult quite widely. So whenever there's a specific exercise in prospect, there's a natural avenue for consultation there. And of course, we're always open to individuals approaching us with their views, which we'll take into account in whatever way is most appropriate.
Thank you. Questions 4 through to 7 to the Archbishop's Council. Mr. Mark Sheard to reply to question 4.
Supplementary.
Supplementary.
Adrian Greenwood, Southwark 411. Thank you, Mark, for the answer, which is encouraging, but it remains very early days in what will be a longish journey of called for culture change. So please, could there be a detailed report on progress with implementation to the Synod in July 2018, supported by a fringe meeting which can focus, among other things, on the lessons learned about implementing culture change from the first round of events for the discipleship learning communities. I, for one, am particularly interested in the fourth of the recommended next steps on page 26 and 27 of GS 2056, namely the remodelling, the selection, training and ongoing ministerial development of clergy in line with the priority of lay formation and discipleship.
Thank you very much, Adrian. I'm not going to go into too much of the detail at this stage, bearing in mind the long list of questions ahead of us, but I think you and I would be in exactly the same place in believing that setting God's people free is crucial for us to achieve the mission that Loretta just so wonderfully outlined for us. And that mission will be impeded if we don't progress urgently and thoroughly. So I would urge the Business Committee, and indeed yourself, if you have any influence in that area, to try and make as much time available in July for us to explore this further and report on progress, both in full General Synod and indeed in a fringe meeting.
Thank you. Question 5, again, Mr. Sheard, supplementary.
Priscilla White, Birmingham, 65. Now, I'm no statistician, unlike some others, but given the phrase inherently less precise, I wonder how robust statistical analysis from the worshipping community concept can be. And so the question is, what use is made of that measure, and how is it driving decision-making?
That's a very good question indeed. Thank you very much, Priscilla. The challenge, of course, as you put in your original question, is what is meant by worshipping community, and the fact that it seems to mean different things to different people in different places. So I think I would almost turn the question back and say that the real value in this data comes in how different those providing the data can see the trends in their own worshipping communities, and I would encourage them to look at it. I heard of a parish recently that was quite appalled to discover that it had got a 60% decline in its worshipping community. It then went and looked at the data and saw that actually it had been using completely different measures. So my encouragement to you is to look closely at how you submit that data in your parishes and then use it to monitor your own performance, because it means most to you.
Thank you. Question 6.
Supplementary.
Supplementary again.
Priscilla White, Birmingham, 65 still, I think. Confirmations are a mark in many places, hopefully everywhere, of a significant step in faith. Therefore, they are inherently missional. Therefore, will it be considered to add confirmations to the statistics for mission so that they appear in the same place as all those other important missional things, including worshipping community, which will then appear on our dashboards and provide good, robust statistical analysis?
Thank you again for that. I share your enthusiasm. I believe that confirmations are indeed truly missional, and it's something that we were discussing earlier today. To date, there hasn't been a great deal of request for that. One particular diocese has asked for data on that related to individual churches as opposed to the diocese as a whole. I think you raise a very interesting question, and I wouldn't want to take up too much of Synod's time going into details of data definition and how we collect it. But I wonder if you and I might have a discussion offline on that. I'd be very interested to hear more from you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Question 7, the Archbishop of Canterbury to reply. Supplementary, Mr. Caskey.
Graham Caskey, Oxford 375. Thank you, Archbishop, for his answer. In light of the correlational evidence showing a father attending church regularly substantially increases the likelihood his children will do the same, how will the Archbishop's Council ensure this evidence is given due consideration in the very welcoming upcoming wide discussion?
I am so very sorry. I haven't got perfect hearing, and I'm not finding the microphones at all easy today. Could you just repeat that?
Yes, certainly. In light of the correlational evidence showing a father attending church regularly substantially increases the likelihood his children will do the same, how will the Archbishop's Council ensure this evidence is given due consideration in the welcome upcoming wide discussion?
Thank you. It's a very helpful question. We have recently, in the last few weeks, written to all bishops asking them to take into, through the regional meetings, asking them to take into, or to have a fresh look at this area. And we will certainly take account of that evidence. I can say from personal experience that I did attend church pretty regularly as my children grew up. And it had a mixed reception, which, like, can't you just shut up for a while? But that apart, I think what you say is a very important point. It is one we've got to take into account as we begin the work on this. This is an area of huge importance, and it strikes me as it should not be too difficult to persuade church-going parents to wish to pass on the faith to their children. But it's more complicated than it looks, but thank you.
Thank you. Our next round of questions are directed mostly to the House of Bishops. Questions 8 and 9, I've given permission for the Archbishop to answer to both together.
Supplementary.
Supplementary, Mr. Caskey.
Okay, Graham Caskey, Oxford 375. Thank the Archbishop again for his answer. In light of the urgency of the situation set out in the 2016 Statistics Remission, when, as a synod, can we expect to see the first practical steps emanating from this work in order to help convince more Anglican families of their responsibility to pass on to their children what the Epistle of Jude describes aptly as the faith that was once for all entrusted to God's holy people?
Thank you very much indeed. We can expect action to emerge pretty rapidly in terms of the Church of England. That is to say, I would hope within a year or so that we should have the first materials coming out. I think this is such a difficult area because it is the responsibility of families and it is the responsibility of local churches. And directives from on high don't always help. What has to happen is people have to have good resources for this. The first one has just been published. Another major resource is being worked on, and the way in which we train and encourage and teach people through catechesis is also being prepared and worked on at the moment. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Supplementary.
Supplementary. Dr. Richmond.
Richmond, Norwich 180. Thank you so much for the encouraging response, and I'm so glad that there's going to be a discussion. In light of the fact that there are many things that clamour for attention, and taking into account that it isn't always a thing from on high that helps, is there a plan to make this a specific, explicit priority above other things and the Archbishop's Council to major on it?
I can't answer for the Archbishop's Council without consulting them first, and I think this question is to the House of Bishops. But I certainly am aware that the bishops consider it to be an important area, and that the new evangelism department at Church House has this as a very high priority. So I would hope it comes within the general priority of evangelism, which is within the quinquennial goals, and of the development of spirituality, and I would expect that to be pursued at every level of the church as a central feature.
Supplementary.
Supplementary, Mr. Spears, and then Mr. Oldham.
Pete Spears, Liverpool 156. Would the Archbishop agree with me that the bishops could approach the church commissioners with an SDF bid for exactly this sort of work in their own diocese, given such the important priority that it is?
Pete, I learned quite early always to agree with you, and I certainly agree with you on that. I think it would be good to have bids like that. I don't sit on the SCF board, so I can't guarantee what will happen, but I think it would be very welcome. Thank you.
Mr. Oldham, I think we need a microphone.
We certainly do.
Gavin Oldham, Oxford 378. Is there any evidence to suggest that the more we try to walk alongside people rather than preach down to them, the more we can actually, they'll be able to recognize that we are recognizing that God is working with them, and that the unconditional love, which is God, actually is already active within their families, and therefore, that we're coming alongside that rather than actually trying to market something, as it were. Would that help?
Thank you, Gavin, very much indeed. The only word in that I would want to strike out of your question is rather than. I think it's both and. All witness and sharing of faith begins with genuine loving relationship that cares for the whole person without exception. But at some point, if people ask, and when people ask, and as you talk, you have to be willing to say something as well. It's not marketing it, it's testimony, it's witnessing and sharing to your own knowledge and experience of the God who's reached out to us in Jesus Christ. And it's both and. If we aren't walking alongside, of course it's a waste of time. But if we're walking alongside and someone asks us and we don't explain, I go to Peter's first letter, so, chapter 3, and this is a very old question. Always be ready to give an explanation for the hope that is within you. And so I think it's both and. But thank you.
Thank you. Question 10, Archbishop to reply. Mrs. Leaf?
Susie Leaf, Truro 421. Thank you, Archbishop. How would you respond to the concerns raised by some of those planning to attend GAFCON who feel that rather than being listened to, as you describe in your answer, they've actually been warned off attending by other senior colleagues?
Well, all I can say is that when I have been asked, I have said, totally openly, that having talked to numerous primates about this who are part of GAFCON, notably people like the primate of Kenya, that where GAFCON is acting as a ginger group, a source of prayer and renewal of spiritual life within God's people around the world and within the Anglican Communion within that, it is a very good thing. I have not warned people off attending, but I can't speak for other people, and you don't give me, if you give me examples privately, I'm happy to speak privately to people. Thank you.
Thank you.
Questions 11 and 12, again to the Archbishop, being taken together.
Sorry.
Supplementary, Miss Buggs?
Debbie Buggs, London 353. Thank you for the response. The list of companion links listed at Appendix B of GS 2081 doesn't indicate which links are impaired. Please could it be reissued giving that information?
I'm sorry, which links are what?
The companion links
Yes,
mentioned.
but you said it doesn't list which links are something. And
which are impaired.
Impaired?
Mm-hmm. I'm thinking of the Liverpool and Nigerian impaired links, or non-existent links.
I'm not sure. Thank you very much. It's a very interesting question. I'm obviously familiar with that one, having been Dean of Liverpool and having visited Akure while I was Dean of Liverpool and knowing the country reasonably well in Nigeria. How do we, I suppose I want to ask the question about how we define impaired. When I visited Akure, there was a very strong and warm link. There were big questions that were being raised, but it continued to be a warm link. And I think companion links are not something that you can categorize that easily in that way, because you have to look at the whole range of the connections between the diocese, between the two dioceses, over a prolonged period of time. So I think I would be a little reluctant to get into that sort of, forgive me using this term because of course it's unusual for me to do so, that slightly managerial approach to it.
Thank you. Question 13. Archbishop of Canterbury to reply.
Supplementary.
You're getting bored with me.
Yes, Mr. Banting.
David Banting, 80. I'm not quite sure if the jelly's beginning to melt a little in my supplementary. Your reply suggested it's not proved necessary for the House of Bishops to consider the guidelines, and yet it also says that he's welcomed in many, but that is not in all, and also it recognises that there is a variety of response, for example, from the most encouraging review, very helpful review of the London plan, stimulated by the acting bishop and the new bishop, most exciting how that might be coming out, but also through to the other end of the spectrum, two dioceses I'm not allowed to mention and wouldn't want to, but two in the southern province, in your province, very different responses. What would be necessary to prove it necessary for the House of Bishops to consider consistent or guidelines for consistency?
Well, in the first place, I think that's a hypothetical question asking for my opinion, and I think if I remember rightly, I'm not allowed to answer that specifically. Correct. But I will
your answer gives an opinion. It is proved not necessary. So
Mr. Banting, you've asked your question. The Archbishop will answer as he sees appropriate.
Thank you. And I have to say, David, in the 40 years we've known each other, I've never noticed jelly at any point, but thank you. I think we have a very clear system set out. We have the 5 guiding principles, and as was hinted in, or was said very specifically in the debate we had earlier on the excellent report by Professor O'Donovan and his team, on occasions where there has been doubt about people's willingness to observe them, both the Archbishop of York and I have ruled that where there's been an attempt to to say they would not be observed, we've ruled that out of order very quickly. The 5 guiding principles give us a very clear framework. In addition, there is the Ombudsman, who has proved extremely independent, extremely vigorous, and extremely trustworthy. And where there is evidence that the guiding principles and the agreement come to in 2014 have not been observed, there are mechanisms for dealing with it. And therefore, I would say that I cannot envisage at present circumstances in which the House of Bishops should revisit that. Where I hear, I mean, I yield to no one in my admiration of Rod, who I would consider, Bishop Rod, who I would consider as both an exceptional person and a good and wise friend who has helped me a great deal, and many other bishops. If I hear that he's got specific problems and I see him regularly and ask, I do seek to raise them privately with the people concerned. But there is a very clear mechanism and I don't see the need for changing it.
Thank you. We're going to give the Archbishop a breather for a moment or two now. Question 14, the Bishop of Leeds to reply. No. Question 15, the Bishop of St Edmundsbury and Ipswich to reply.
Supplementary.
A supplementary to 15.
Tim Hine, 247 Bath and Wells. When is it planned to hold the next ministry division consultation on SSMs?
I don't know. I will find out for you.
Thank you. Now, question 16 and 17. We're going to need notice paper number 7. There was a bit of a mess up in the printing. So if you've got notice paper 7, it should have been on your seats. Question 16. Bishop, to the Forsters to reply.
Supplementary.
Supplementary.
Luke Miller, 162, London, I Am Today and Erratum. Thank you, Bishop Tim, for your answers. Are there plans to ensure the pathways system to which you refer in your answer collects data in all areas of diversity, including church tradition, and makes it available to ensure assertions like the one that I have made, that only 1/3 of those in senior positions not being bishops who are unable to accept the ordained ministry of women are speaking to you, and that that assertions like that can be checked?
Thank you. I think I can say that there are plans to try and make sure the pathway system is as robust as possible, but clearly this depends to some degree on self-identification. And the issue of self-identification in the matter of church tradition is complex. It may also involve dioceses in getting their data back to the centre, and sometimes some dioceses, I'm told, don't always get the data back as well as they might.
Thank you. Question 17.
Supplementary.
Supplementary.
Luke Miller, 162, London. Noting that Sir Philip Moore's recommendation 2, to which you refer, applies to the process for appointing bishops, so that my concern is for non-episcopal senior appointments. What aspects of the processes to which Sir Philip refers throw light on those senior appointments which are often advertised and interviewed, but which nevertheless seem to result in tiny numbers of those unable on theological grounds to accept the ordained ministry of women to be appointed?
What aspects?
What aspects of those things to which Sir Philip refers in his report, which is focusing on episcopal appointments, would apply to those things which are for non-episcopal appointments?
I think Sir Philip Moore's report applies to all appointments, actually. I think we can learn lessons on all things. It's just the case that actually in some appointments we don't collect the data in the same, or we are not able to collect the data in the same way as we are in some others.
Question 18, Bishop of the Forces replying. Supplementary, Miss Ozanne.
Ozanne, Oxford 379. Thank you for your answer. Sadly, though, it shows perfectly why reflecting on Bishop James's report and charter would be significantly beneficial to the House, as the charter assures victims of the conduct that they can expect and hold the Church to account. It's about proving what we want to put the victims first. So can I therefore ask that the report patronising disposition of unaccountable power, and particularly the Victims' Charter, be urgently reviewed and signed by the House of Bishops, so that we, the victims, might be given some assurance about how we can be treated?
I'm more than happy to give assurance that I will certainly read it myself and see whether I can feed it in, not wishing to steal his thunder, but I would also encourage Synod members to read the book I think they're being given, Bread Not Stones, as another contribution to hearing the voice of survivors.
Yes. Question 19, the Archbishop of York to reply. Question 20.
Supplementary.
Supplementary, Mr. Bainan.
Thank you, Archbishop, for your clear answer. Winbine and Worcester 237. I believe I speak for not a few DDOs and perhaps ordinands in asking that clear guidance as to what appropriate inquiries actually are, so that this is consistent across the diocese, might be something that could be considered as a first step towards a full review of the directions.
I don't see why the archbishops and bishops cannot consider what you're saying, but I, for one, don't believe that the system is over-intrusive. Is there protect both individuals whereas a church? Does it work? Again, we might not all agree about this, but I want to thank God for all those willing to embark on it, given their personal circumstances, as part of the process of designing God's course. So, as somebody who's been dealing with the faculties, I'm always, well, it's hard, it's difficult, but people are willing to go through this, and I hope it's done sensitively and with wisdom and understanding and a bit of insight. So I, as one who operates it, at least in my province, I actually think all bishops are very diligent in the way they do.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Question 21. Supplementary.
David Lamming, 399 St Edmundsbury in Ipswich. Thank you, Archbishop, for the answer. You refer to Clause 5 of the Terms of Reference of the Delegation Committee and the duty to, quote, report promptly and regularly on its activities and decisions to the House. Paper GS MISC 1179, which is the summary of decisions of the House of Bishops, just tells us in paragraph 5 that the House of Bishops meeting last December, quote, received updates on the decisions of the Delegation Committee, but does not say what those decisions were. In the interests of transparency, can you please inform Synod what those decisions were, how much time the full House of Bishops spent considering them, and what their status is? Were they adopted to become, in effect, decisions of the House of Bishops?
I think, Archbishop, we could do without a whole list of them because we have to keep the time down, but if you could give a way to reply.
Well, I think go back in 2015 when the matter was first discussed by the House, the possibility of that actual diocesan motion coming, and what will be the response to the section on liturgy. And it took a very clear decision, which in fact you now find reported by the Delegation Committee. It again did return, was in the paper. So the fact that an item is referred to the House of Bishops Delegation Committee does not mean that the item is treated with any less care or consideration. The contrary actually is true. The House will always have the opportunity to respond to the regular reporting of actions, of decisions, and it will be for members of the House to raise questions when these reports are actually given. I did see them, I did read them, therefore, anybody who say they were not there, well, I can't speak for everybody.
Thank you. Questions 22 and 23 being taken together by the Bishop of Coventry. We have a supplementary.
Jenny Humphreys, Bath and Wells 248. Thank you. I can find no reference in any of the recent reports, responses and resources about the history and theology of patriarchy. Will the new group please address this, bearing in mind that the House of Bishops released their response yesterday on the 100th anniversary of some women being allowed to vote, a development in 1918 that was resisted by bishops to a man.
Very topical, thank you very much. I think, as you know, the Faith and Order Commission has produced a piece of work. It's a piece of work that we were working on a little bit before the Sir Philip Moore report was delivered, and then we responded to that recommendation by Sir Philip. I think we now need to see how that lands and to see what gaps there might be in that work we've done, and then, as the Archbishop's statement says, decide whether anything needs to be taken forward and what. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, supplementary, Ms. Stevens.
Anne Stevens, London 161. It's about the gaps, really, though I've only had a cursory reading in the short time available. But this is the theological reflection on the 5 guiding principles that Sir Philip asked for in paragraph 192A. But there was another request challenge in 192B for theological and pastoral reflection on the way that the principles are impacting on the ground, particularly at parish level. Would the bishops therefore please consider some more work in this area, not only from the implementation group, but also from the Faith and Order Commission, on the theological impact of things like the shared cure of souls and the validity of the sacraments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As you'll see when you've had a chance to look at it a little more closely, one of the chapters does try to deal with, as it were, matters on the ground. But it may well be that the House will feel that there's more detailed work that could be done, more case study work. I think that's quite possible. So again, I would say let's see how the report is received, where the gaps are, and what, if anything, does need to be taken forward to the next stage. Thank you.
Thank you. 24. 25. Mr. Scowen.
Scowen, London 358. Have I understood correctly from the Bishop's answer that the House undertook no biblical or theological or anthropological reflection before issuing the recent statement in GS MISC 1178 in response to the Blackburn motion passed last July, or before the Archbishop commended the guidance to church schools on transgender issues published last autumn? If that is the case, will the House refrain from making further pronouncements on these issues before they have undertaken such reflection?
Thank you very much. I think the last part of your question, I sort of have an interest in this because I have a heavy involvement in the teaching document. So I think there would be a certain wisdom, where possible, to allow that process to take its course. It's a complex process. It's being undergone with some rigour. But I can see that that's not always the case, and that there was a need to produce an updated version of Valuing God's Children. That was a piece of work that the Education Office did. I'm not aware of formal discussion in the House of Bishops, but not everything that each department undertakes can get to have that sort of discussion. I could say more about the document, but I don't think you want an opinion from me. There was one other, in terms of the discussion, did you say, Clive, following over the statement from the House of Bishop about transgender liturgies? Was that the one you referred to?
I referred to that, and I was asking for confirmation that no theological or biblical reflection had been undertaken before that statement was issued, and asking whether in future such reflection would precede the making of such statements.
I'm sure theological reflection and significant thought was given to that. My memory is that it wasn't given in a plenary session of the House of Bishops, but I can assure you that bishops don't make statements without thinking theologically about them.
Thank you. Supplementary, Mr. Ayres.
Supplementary, Paul Ayres, Leeds 130. As part of the rigorous study, what investigations will be made into the emerging subculture of gender questioning amongst children and young people, both within their own subculture through social media and also in the support offered by medical and other professionals to the choices made at such a very young and vulnerable age?
Yeah, thank you very much. Very, very good question. We do have a group led by the soon-to-be Bishop of London on scientific and, biological and social sciences, of course, and that's a very fine group of people with expertise who will give this rigorous thought. And then, this is the really interesting, that work will be brought into relationship with the work that the other groups are doing. Moreover, what we are wanting to do is not just do that thinking within the groups and across the groups, so that's sort of complex enough, but also each group is charged with wider consultation. And we are thinking, and it would be very good to have your advice on this, about ways and exploring ways significantly about how we can cascade that out. That's an ambitious thing to attempt, but as far as possible, so that we can listen in on all sorts of contexts. Thank you.
Thank you. 26. Thank you. 27 to be answered by the Bishop of Durham.
Supplementary.
Supplementary. Mr. Caudle.
Simon Cordell, Hereford 127. I'm very grateful for the informative answer given. Has the committee taken time to look at the theological basis and historic practice and development of the Ministry of Absolution? And is the committee planning to frame the report in a way which might commend itself to the House of Bishops not only as a document for information, but also the basis of a document for teaching about this important ministry in the wider church?
The very short answer is absolutely. There's major theological reflection on the whole history of the confessional and how that's unfolded through the years. And the intention is also to have a fairly major section on what training should therefore flow from it.
Thank you.
Question 28, the Bishop of Carlisle to respond. Ms. Ozanne.
Supplementary. Ozanne, Oxford 379. Thank you, Bishop James. Sorry. It's indeed unfortunate that no further correspondence has taken place with Her Majesty's government following the completely inadequate response that pointed us to the very document we just actually endorsed. A call to ban fixed odds betting terminals seems to have had far more attention and action by bishops than the NCI's. Could I ask Bishop James, in the light of the answer deferring the matter to diocesan bishops, what action you've taken in your diocese to ensure that your clergy are aware of the dangers of conversion therapy, particularly in the light of a highly controversial visit of Franklin Graham, which will be happening nearby very shortly?
I'm afraid, Miss Ozanne, you cannot ask the bishop what he's doing in his own diocese. This is a question to the House of Bishops.
Okay,
Thank
apologies.
you.
Thank you.
29. 30. Supplementary, Mrs. Foreman.
Anne Foreman, Exeter 308. Thank you very much, Bishop, for what feels like a very encouraging reply, particularly in respect of the forthcoming guidance that the Pastoral Advisory Group is going to make to enable candidates to answer the question in the ordination question that you quote. May I make a suggestion, please, that your answer, the expectation of dioceses, suggests that there's a consistency, whereas as a BAP advisor, I know full well that there's a very wide range of responses. So, in the light of the work that's going to be done by the Pastoral Advisory Group, could consideration be given to either collecting information about current practice or perhaps piloting with a few dioceses, abolishing asking about issues in human sexuality, and instead putting a question that is about the ordination question, which resonates so well with the 21st century understanding of being human and being sexual, the question about how their lives are lived. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I'm sure that will be taken up by that group, and I'd be very interested to follow that up. Can I just want to remind us of one paragraph or sentence that's in Issues in Human Sexuality, which for me puts this in a better perspective. They write in that document, "We do not think it right to interrogate individuals on their sexual lives unless there are strong reasons for doing so. Ordinarily, it should be left to candidates' own consciences to act responsibly in this manner." So we would want to look at the responses that you're suggesting in the light of that.
Supplementary.
Supplementary, Mr. Scowen.
Scowen, London 358. I wasn't clear from the Bishop's written answer. Will candidates be asked whether they are willing to live within the guidelines in Issues in Human Sexuality until that document is superseded by some new teaching document, or are we on a slippery slope away from it?
They'll be asked that question unless the advisory group comes back with a different approach, which we'll just have to wait and see on that.
And that will be reported to Synod.
You've asked your question, Mr. Scowen. Thank you very much. Number 31, Ms. Hitchener, supplementary. Bishop of Newcastle replying. Ms. Hitchener.
Thank you for the very helpful and enlightening response. My supplementary question is, are there plans to include people who experience gender dysphoria on the pastoral care group for LGBT people, as well as people who experience same-sex attraction?
Thank you. We've had a real issue right from the beginning in recognising that whilst we want to have a huge range of experience represented on the group, we also want a group that is workable. And so we recognise that we cannot have, as a member of the group, people from every kind of experience. But we are, as a way of working, we are completely committed to a meaningful engagement with relevant stakeholders as part of our way of working. And we warmly welcome, I warmly welcome, people writing to me and sharing their experience so that our work can be enriched with those perspectives.
Supplementary, Ms. Ozanne.
Ozanne, Oxford 379. Thank you, Bishop Christine. It's good to hear that the group are open to hearing LGBTI Christians' experiences. But can I ask, what safeguards are in place for those who are extremely reluctant to share what are often highly traumatic experiences of how they've been treated in their churches when they've come out, when they know that there are various members on the group who subscribe to the Nashville Statement and the so-called EA affirmations, which propose the very practices that was the cause of their pain and suffering in the first place? Can they write in complete confidence to just you, and will their identity, please, be concealed?
This is a really important question, Jane, and yes, they can write to me, and I would, of course, always respect confidence when asked to, but we're also beyond that in the process of working out proper protocols, ethical protocols, to make sure that experience is anonymised so that we can gain from the experience without betraying the identity of people and increasing their vulnerability. We're very grateful for their courage in coming forward.
Thank you very much.
Okay. I do have the power to allow an extra supplementary, and I'm giving that to the prolocutor.
Thank you. Chair, Simon Butler, Southwark 219. I must admit to some confusion, and I would say it's a dysphoria, because I'm concerned, and I'd like you to respond not just on behalf of you, but on behalf of the Bishop of Coventry as well, that we are confusing matters of gender and matters of sexuality at the outset of this conversation. Unless you can pull those apart, you are going to produce a very unsatisfactory document. Could you comment on that, please?
I can't respond on behalf of the Bishop of Coventry. I can only respond as myself as chair of the Pastoral Advisory Group. Yes, this is a very complicated issue, and we are in the middle of looking with great rigour, actually, at our terms of reference to try to clarify this. And it is important that we do have clarity. So thank you for the question.
Thank you. Number 32, Dr. Maltby.
Thank you. Judith Maltby, University's TEIs of 452. Thank you for your answer, Bishop. Am I right in reading your answer to mean that clergy should, in pastoral situations of this kind, regard same-sex marriage and civil partnerships as ideally being things entered to be permanent, faithful, and stable?
I think you're making a leap in the argument that doesn't necessarily help us understand what we're doing here. The guidance that's there about how we deal with folk who are remarrying after a divorce was put in place on the basis of specific legislation that the Church of England agreed in order to cater for circumstances where people came to wanting a church marriage after a divorce. That's there, and it has an origin in those places. Because the government, in its wisdom, decided that it should legislate for same-sex marriage, it split the understanding of marriage between how the Church of England operates and how the government operates. My answer gives you how it is possible for people to engage pastorally with some people who've been involved in a same-sex partnership which has been solemnised by the state. In the end, this is about pastoral nous. When you ask clergy to investigate the circumstances of people who are being married, you need to give them guidance. There is a form to do so. Asking them to use that form in the circumstances in which you outline is, it seems to me, a very sensible way of helping them assess pastorally, if they can't do it for themselves, what the circumstances of the couple presenting themselves might be.
Thank you. 333 and 30. Oh, Mrs. Scowen on this one. Yes?
32. Since the Church teaches that marriage is the union of one man with one woman, what relevance does the previous same-sex relationship have, particularly with regard to the duty of clergy to marry parishioners who come seeking marriage in accordance with the rights of the Church of England?
It has relevance insofar as it gives you a framework where two people have made a commitment which is recognised by the state, and where one has then to identify what are the pastoral circumstances that you're addressing. In the end, the reality for most bishops is that we say to our clergy, you have perfect freedom to solemnise matrimony between two persons. You don't actually, in fact, need the permission of the bishop, because you can ignore what the circumstances are of any previous marriage or relationship and marry people by banns. Most of our clergy are sensible and recognise that we have guidance on the matter of the remarriage of divorcees, and they go there. What I'm saying to you is, I would hope that clergy would take pastoral advice. In the end, this isn't about us legislating for people. It's relying on the fact that we share the cure of souls with our parish priests, and they get on with it. And if they need to ask questions of their bishops, they do. And we give advice in individual circumstances.
Thank you. Numbers 33 and 34 being answered together. Mrs. Graham?
Supplementary. Thank you. Carolyn Graham, Guildford 317. I understood that bishops had shown a commitment to listen and to talk with rather than about LGBTI people. If that's the case, can I ask whether any transgender Christians are involved in the decision that the House of Bishops delegation committee made on this important matter, to see how they responded to the new recommendations and whether these recommendations met their needs?
Let me backtrack, I think, a bit on the process, because there seems an awful lot of misunderstanding, both on the blogs and elsewhere, about what took place. The House of Bishops has had a difficulty in how it processes its business in the past. We undertook a governance review to say, how can it be that we can discuss items and issues that are presented to us in a more full way, because much of what was going on in the House of Bishops was deemed business that just went straight through. We set up a delegation committee. The delegation committee, therefore, is not an abrogation of responsibility. It's actually a place where we can chew over major issues under the heading of some of the things that are set out in this paragraph, and do it better. So the delegation committee isn't a kind of, oh, we're ignoring the fact that it needs to be discussed approach. It's a way of us processing things better. It's about better governance, not worse. It's also about us saying, and I slightly regret that people keep calling us on, did we pray enough about it? That's not particularly mature kind of debate between Christians. All our business is conducted in prayer. We have explicit prayer together when we have our meetings, and it's not really for people to say, oh, did you pray enough in order to get to the answer that you received and got to? The answer to the question you're raising is no, we didn't. What we did was we dealt with the request of the House of Bishops. We said, there is an understanding, and the Bishop of Exeter will be answering in more detail about the theological understanding here, but where we got to is, if people are being initiated into Christ, there is one sacrament by which that happens. It is baptism. And that is standard for the Church. There are people who come to us wanting to be treated in a pastoral way because they've had experiences which make them want to reaffirm their baptismal promises. It's not just about the particular class of folk who are being addressed here. It's about, for instance, people who have changed their faith and then come back to the Christian faith. And in all kinds of circumstances, bishops and others who are agents of initiation will say, yes, you can renew your vows and we'll give you proper pastoral provision to be able to do that. But again, we leave it to local initiative as to how that takes place. So, no, we didn't at this stage consult people.
I think you need to wind up. You've been 2.5 minutes in.
I'm sorry, but it needs a full explanation, Chair, because it's been so misrepresented out there in social media. So we didn't. The Bishop of Exeter will answer you more fully on how we are going to engage in the process of giving pastoral guidance here on in.
I hope he'll answer with brevity as well. Canon Humphreys.
Thank you.
Canon Humphreys first.
Jenny Humphreys, Bath and Wells 248. My supplementary was substantially much the same as Mrs. Graham, so in the interests of time, I am not going to read it again, as it were, but just to note the disappointment voiced by many, both by the content and process. Thank you.
Thank you. Supplementary from Mr. Reid.
Charles Reid, 181 Norwich, the Diocese for Episcopal Longevity. When the House was considering the options, did it consider how long it would take to put bespoke commended liturgies through a synodical process, as opposed to encouraging people to use what's already there? And was that a factor in making the decision the House made?
No, it was based on the theological principle that initiation into Christ is through baptism.
Supplementary, Mr. Lamming.
David Lamming, 399 St Ebs and Ips. Thank you, Bishop, for your explanation of the process of the delegation committee, which I think is quite helpful for the Synod to have that information. The Church Times reported that...
I think we did a question, not a Church Times report, Mr. Lamming. This is the fourth question, supplementary on this item.
I'll short it by saying, in the interest of transparency, can those decisions, which are based on delegation committee reports, be identified as such and properly reported in a summary of decisions?
I think it's a no-brainer and we ought to do it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That moves us on to questions 35 and 36 to be answered by the Bishop of Exeter.
Supplementary.
Supplementary.
James Carey, 246, Bath and Wells. Thank you for the answer provided. How will the House of Bishops ensure that the content of the teaching document that's forthcoming on human sexuality will not be prejudiced by the House of Bishops statement in GS 1178 that gender transition marked by an affirmation of baptismal faith is a moment of personal renewal?
Thank you for your question. Picking up on that and what Bishop Peat was saying, I think it might be helpful again just to talk a bit more about the process and about how we're going forward from here. Because following the General Synod debate, I mean, one of the things I would say, there's absolutely no rowing back on that, because I think we all felt it was absolutely imperative that as a church that we are welcoming and affirming to transgendered people. And I felt that the Archbishop of York's very powerful speech resonated with so many of us there. And going forward, whatever people have thought about the process hitherto, what I would say is the fact that as bishops, individually, we've been listening and engaging with trans people, listening to what they're saying, but also listening to clergy as they're trying to respond to trans people and the things that are coming towards us. That there's a whole variety of expectations and needs that are there. And it became quite clear that it isn't a case of one size fits all. And so therefore, one of the things that came out was in the October, the Liturgical Commission, of which I'm chair, we had a survey of what material have we actually got within the volume of common worship, all those authorised and commended liturgies, which might be available, and made those available to the delegation committee. And out of that came a clear sense, as Bishop Peat was saying, that it was a celebration of the affirmation of baptismal faith was the good way forward, and that should be at the core and constellated around that. What's appropriate in a particular case with a particular person in a particular situation? In terms of the guidance which the General Secretary was saying in his memo that was issued, as we're going forward from this, the next step in that process will be myself, Bishop of Hereford, who's the Vice Chair of the Commission. We're meeting with some transgendered clergy to discuss with them what the shape of that will be, because we really want to get this right. I think that's really important. It's really important that it be pastoral, that it be affirming, that it be welcoming. And I think that what Bishop Richard and I feel very much is that we need to be talking with and not talking about. And so we need to talk together. And out of that refinement, later this year, we'll be able to produce a document for giving some guidance on how this particular liturgical rite can be used.
Thank you. A supplementary, Mrs. Herbert?
Caroline Herbert, Norwich, 372. And further to what you were saying about the guidance, I'd like to ask, will it make clear that the affirmation of baptism service is about marking the spiritual renewal, and it's a person's recommitment to bringing their life under the lordship of Christ in response to their faith, or perhaps a renewed commitment to faith, as the Bishop of Willesden said, and that it's that faith in Christ's saving work on the cross through which we have forgiveness of sins?
Indeed,
Will that be there?
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm very grateful to members of Synod who have been quite succinct in asking questions. Some of my colleagues here at the front are not being quite succinct. I don't mean you particularly, Bishop, but we haven't always been quite so succinct in answering. So we can try to be brief in the answers as well as in the giving of the supplementaries. I'm sure Synod will be grateful. Question 37, Ms. Michelle Williams.
Supplementary. Andrea Minicella Williams, Chichester 286. How will the reaffirmation of baptismal faith to mark a claimed change of gender affect the name recorded in the baptismal register if the person has changed their name as they usually do?
What is in the baptismal register is a legal record and cannot be altered.
Thank you. 38. 39. Supplementary.
This is slightly back to procedure.
Name.
Oh, sorry, Neil Patterson, Hereford 128. Slightly back to procedure. Just trying to clarify on a point made earlier by the Archbishop of York, that the House considered the subject of the Blackburn motion when it was first tabled in 2015. Can you clarify whether it's common practice to consider and reach a conclusion of the whole House before a motion is brought to Synod which asks for a cause, as it were?
Could you ask that again?
So,
I'm struggling to see how this is relevant to the particular question, the supplementary. Thank you. Number 40. Oh, sorry, supplementary, gentleman over there.
Angus Gowdy, Durham 298. Thank you, Bishop, for your answer, anticipating further encouragement and guidance, and also your comments earlier about the great variety of situations that an incumbent might find themselves in. In the interim, in view of the newness of this area for many incumbents who will be faced with needs outside their experience, how to and how far they may devise a service around a welcome in a new name and gender. Will the House read and commend some of the excellent examples of prayers used already? For example, those mentioned in speeches back in July, or those used in St Bride's Church Open Table in Liverpool?
Thank you for that offer. Yes, certainly, what I can say is that the Liturgical Commission, and specifically, as I've been saying, as we're taking this forward, that's specifically, we would like to have a look at what is already available. Thank you.
Point of order, Prolocutor.
Simon Butler, Southwark 219. As we move on to questions about safeguarding and the issues that have created a little bit of febrileness, I wonder if we might, before we begin, remember in silence both survivors and those who administer the Church's work in safeguarding before we move on to these potentially conflictual questions.
I'm very happy to do that. We will have a short period of silence to reflect. Thank you. Question 40. Question 41, Bishop of Bath and Wells to reply. 42. Supplementary to 42, Prolocutor.
wasn't expecting to be quite on my feet so quickly. Simon, about the 219. In the answer the Bishop has given, he recognised the duty of the House that survivors are treated fairly. I wonder if he could comment whether the absence of any treatment of respondents is an omission from the answer or an omission in the duties laid down to the House.
It's very clearly an omission from the answer, and thank you for clarifying that. And Simon, thank you for just calling us to pause and to pray before we began this part of our questions.
Thank you. 43. Yes, supplementary, Mr. Robinson.
Tiff Robinson, 209 Ebonsbury and Ipswich. Given that registered sex offenders sometimes seek to find positions of trust from which to form relationship with children and vulnerable adults, should the House of Bishops be so relaxed about the inability to carry out enhanced DBS checks on lay people who robe and are authorised to lead worship in our churches Sunday by Sunday?
I trust that the word relaxed is not one that we want to use in terms of being vigilant. It's very clear from the guidance that has been issued by the House of Bishops, that's been widely accepted, being taken forward and certainly being implemented, that is far from the reality in our parishes and our dioceses. If there are particular questions about that, and you've raised one or two already, I'd gladly receive them, and I'd refer some of them to the National Safeguarding Team for their further guidance or consideration.
Thank you.
Thank you. 44, which I refer you to order the 10th notice paper. 45. Supplementary, Mrs. Ann.
Roseanne, Oxford 379. In the light of the fact that we now know that it takes on average 8 years for a woman to come forward who has experienced some form of sexual harassment, and I'm not talking sexual abuse, and therefore they are ruled out of time and have to apply for the president of tribunals, what guidelines can the Church offer, please, for how the abuser and the victim are supposed to interact whilst those decisions are being made? Because it strikes me at the moment we have no guidelines whatsoever, and that is stopping women coming forward.
I'd like to take that forward. I'd like to speak to you about that as well. I'd need to look very carefully at our guidance. If guidance needs to be strengthened in those areas, or if guidance is absent and needs to be written, then we'll undertake that with as much speed as we can. It's an important area.
Thank you.
Thank you. Number 46, Mr. Fender.
Yes, thank you, Bishop Peter, for your answer. Can I just then ask, in the Carlisle report at the very end, there was a very clear statement there that Lord Carlisle drew, which was that he deprecated the continued use of the titles victim and survivor. And indeed, he drew on a parallel report by a High Court judge into Operation Midland, where he also deprecated the use of those titles. So can I ask what particular consideration was given to that part of the report?
This is a question that has come up a number of times before, and indeed the House of Bishops have looked at this terminology very carefully, and it's something that we have debated ourselves. I think the Church, I'm clear, the Church seeks to follow best practice in this area, and when we look at the practice in the NHS, within the police, within the education sector, within most local authorities, we have aligned ourselves with the best practice in those statutory authorities. It is a question that we continue to review. It's a question that has not been finally resolved, but that is the situation at the moment.
Can I remind Synod members, please give your Synod numbers. The stenographers need that information. Mr. Lamming, a supplementary on this one?
Supplementary, David Lamming, 399 St Ebs and Ips. Just coming back to the question about the use of language. The paragraph of the Carlisle report that Mr. Fender's just referred to is at the end, 292, and he says, subject to the replacement throughout the text of the practice guidance of victim survivor with complainant, consistent with the recommendation described above of Sir Richard Henriques, that's the Operation Midland report. The document is sound for cases against living persons. Now, I take it that the House of Bishops would not want to commend or to be seen to be commending a document regarded by Lord Carlisle as unsound in this respect. Since the use of language...
Well, I think we need a question fairly quickly.
Since the use of language can indicate an unconscious bias, will you or will the House of Bishops please reconsider, in particular, that recommendation of Lord Carlisle at the end of his report?
I'm very clear, and I can reassure Synod on this, that all of those recommendations are being considered, and to give Synod an indication of the seriousness and the speed in which this is being considered, I think it's my understanding that an initial report will be going to the National Safeguarding Steering Group in April, with the expectation that some of that new thinking and in the light of the review of Lord Carlisle will be coming to the House of Bishops in May. So those recommendations are being considered, will be considered, and will be brought to the House for further deliberation.
Thank you. Number 47. Supplementary. Yes, Mr. Russell.
Mark Russell, Sheffield 408. Bishop Peter, thank you for this answer. And on behalf of the Synod, thank you for the leadership you're showing in this important area. You have our prayers as to all those impacted by abuse. This answer refers to a specific number of safeguarding concerns and allegations, but I wonder, could you clarify for the Synod that answer by indicating the number of clergy with whom these allegations are against?
Thank you. There's been some reporting in the Daily Mail and other press today, which has perhaps been unhelpful. When you've only got 150 words, perhaps my answer could have answered more fully. I will address that again in Saturday with some more statistics when we have the safeguarding presentation. But to answer your question specifically, out of those 3,300 concerns and allegations that have been brought forward, that concerns all forms of abuse and in all contexts, and only 18% of those relate either to clergy or to church officers. So 82% do not refer directly to clergy or church officers. And although those figures are being produced in the press as evidence that the church has a significant issue around safeguarding, in many ways it also points to another story, that as a church we are embedded into all of our communities. This is about us welcoming people who are perhaps at risk in their communities or maybe a risk to other people. And it's evidence, I think, that as a church we're serving our communities, bearing in mind that most abuse happens within families, within the home, and indeed in the community. So those numbers do look alarming, but actually when we break them down and look at who they relate to and how, I think there is a more encouraging picture of the work of the church at the parish level to keep our communities safe.
Supplementary, Perlocutor.
Simon Butler, Southwark 219. Is there any way of drawing out of these figures the number that refer to historic cases and the number that refer to current concerns and allegations?
The word historic is not one that we would want to use, Simon, at the moment, but recognising that there are cases that are not current in respect of investigation, some work could be done on this. If we can do that by Saturday, I will endeavour to answer that question in my presentation.
Thank you. Number 48. Number 49.
Supplementary.
Supplementary is number 49. Yes.
Prudence Daily 376 Oxford. When did the further information referred to in those statements first come to light, and when did the National Safeguarding Team first become aware of it?
From memory, I can't tell you the exact date, but I can furnish you with that information afterwards. I'm clear, my understanding is clear, that that further information came forward as a result of the publication of the Carlisle report.
Thank you. Number 50. Supplementary number 50, Archdeacon.
Julie Connolty, Rochester 199. My question was not simply asking for general reassurances about the implementation of the Carlisle recommendations. It was specific about what measures were being taken. Those of us with professional qualifications and experience in child protection, risk assessment, or working with sex offenders have for decades watched with some degree of despair at what appears at times to be quite an amateurish approach by the Church. Can Synod be reassured? Can Synod be reassured that we have professionals in place with the appropriate specialist expertise and also policies and procedures that ensure they will be consulted and their advice heeded?
Thank you. Lord Carlisle was very clear. The Church acted in good faith, although he made some very clear criticisms of the processes that were followed at that time, recognising that at that time the establishment of core groups, the establishment of the National Safeguarding Team were very much at their beginning. There has been a reconvened core group to look at this, and in specific answer to your question, we are seeking to follow Lord Carlisle's recommendations and being very mindful of them. So there was, for an example, an independent legal advisor. There was, I believe, someone to represent the family. So those shortcomings and failings that Lord Carlisle has brought to our attention are being addressed.
Thank you. Number 51. Yes, Mr. Fender.
Yes, Carl Fender, Lincoln 342. Thank you once again for your answer, Bishop Peter. In light of your view that those who are called to sit on core groups have the skills and experience, can I then ask if there is any guidance or training given to those who sit on core groups who have to perform the very specific function of that fact-finding role of establishing whether or not an allegation is cogent or not, because that's a very particular skill of sitting on a core group. And I just wonder whether there is any selection process or any skills search amongst those who comprise such a group to see whether or not they have those very particular skills.
Thank you. That's a very appropriate question. Looking back, and that's where we need to start, it was quite clear from what Lord Carlisle said, there was a confusion about process. There was a lack of clarity around process. Guidance has now been put in place for that. More guidance is coming forward to deal with posthumous allegations, to deal with those perhaps who have already died. And in that guidance, those issues have been addressed. But I will look at it again in the light of your question, and I will come back to you if I'm not satisfied with the guidance that we've so far written.
Thank you very much.
There's more guidance to come, I can assure you of that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Number 52. 53 and 54 being taken together.
Supplementary.
Mr. French.
Philip French, Rochester 388. Thank you for the reply, both informative and creative. So for absolute clarity, can we take it that the report as finally published is the report as finally approved by Lord Carlisle, and that there were no significant changes except in respect of factual accuracy or to avoid the risk of identification?
Yes.
Thank you very much.
And it was an independent report. It was Lord Carlisle's decision what went in and what did not go in, and the approach that was taken was the approach that was both set and agreed with Lord Carlisle.
Thank you. Number 55, Mr. Benfield.
Supplementary, Paul Benfield, Blackburn 66. Was the external lawyer there to give advice on due process? And if not, who was to give advice on such process?
I'm afraid, Paul, I don't fully know the answer to that. I think I know the answer, but because this is a formal proceedings, I need to be absolutely clear. It's perhaps worth stating, so Synod know, that I do not get involved in casework. I do not have a professional expertise in safeguarding, and in these matters, I have to be careful that I don't over-intrude in due process. Having said that, I recognise the importance of your question, and it's because it's an important question, I will make sure you get a proper answer.
Thank you. Number 56. Number 57. Mr. Lamming.
Bishop, are you able to at least say whether or not the new information referred to in the media statements issued last week is the information that's referred to in paragraph 5 of the Carlisle report, first published in a free newspaper in June 2016?
I think I probably shouldn't say more at this stage because of the fresh information that has come forward and it's not quite clear what that will mean. I would want to say that the question you ask is a serious one. That when we're talking about matters of safeguarding, this is an absolutely critical matter. And your question that you asked in question 57 gets to the very heart of what safeguarding is about, which is about the well-being of all in society, the mission of the church, and in particular our concern and our regard and our care for victims and survivors of abuse. With regard to your particular question, I think it's probably inappropriate for me to say any more than you have in my written answer.
Thank you. Number 58, Mr. Lamming.
Supplementary, David Lamming, 399 St Ed's and Ips. Can you confirm, as would appear to be the case from the National Safeguarding Team's media statement last week, that the independent investigation now being commissioned through the core group will be considering only the new information and will not be revisiting the allegations made by Carol? Who is being commissioned to carry out the investigation? What are its terms of reference? And what, if any, timescale has been set for it to be concluded and a report submitted to the NST? And in particular, is someone being assigned to the investigation to represent the interests of the late Bishop Bell and his surviving relatives, as recommended in paragraph 21 of the Carlisle Review?
Thank you.
David, I always love it when a question has 5 questions buried into it. With regard to the last of those, I'll say yes. With regard to the thrust of your major questions, I have not yet seen the terms of reference for that group, and it therefore will be inappropriate for me to hazard a guess. But the questions have been noted. I'll make sure you get a reply.
Thank you.
Thank you. Number 59, Mr. Sewell.
Rochester 391. You say that the victim must be believed has never been the case. Lord Carlisle clearly identifies that it had currency in the matter which he was examining, and I could talk about other occasions when I've heard the same.
You could perhaps ask a question,
Yes.
which would be even better.
Be that as it may, you're ahead of me. Be that as it may, are we now unequivocally agreed that this is a misleading and unfair doctrine that has no place in the proper quasi-legal processes of the Church? I press the point simply because it does keep reappearing in the courts every few years, so I need you to assure me that its credibility in the Church is dead, buried with a stake through its heart.
I'd like to draw your attention to the first sentence in my reply to your question 59, where that makes that point very clear indeed.
Thank you. Number 60, Mr. Sewell.
Clearly, we have had transparency after the event, thanks to Lord Carlisle. Beforehand, however, the Church strenuously resisted transparency, giving no information about either the allegations or the core group processes, and confusingly asserted that law precluded it. After Carlisle, shall we see better transparency of progress from start to finish in respect of the new Bell allegation than we did with the first? I sense and am troubled that we are heading down a similar path.
I think you're starting to make a statement there. We've heard the question and the Bishop will reply.
The answer is yes. We will take forward seriously Lord Carlisle's recommendations, and that means that will improve the way that we respond to, the way that we assess, and the way that we manage allegations.
Thank you very much.
The Bishop of Bath and Wells can now sit down for a few minutes. I think he's really grateful for that.
Chair, with your permission, I might just... applause would be inappropriate. Can I draw Synod's attention to this booklet that the Bishop in Lambeth has already drawn your attention to? There is one of these in each of your pigeonholes. It would be very helpful if Synod could collect that as you leave Synod today. Please read it. Please pray about the matters that are raised by those who have been themselves victims of abuse. And you, I'm sure, are already aware that there is an opportunity for us, if we choose to stand with them in silence and in prayer and in reflection on Saturday. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. It is a very moving and quite humbling book to read. Question number 61, Mr. William Knight to reply. Mr. Baldry?
Supplementary, Baldry, 373, Oxford. Does the Secretary-General agree that 2.5 years since the decision of General Synod just to hold a meeting of members is painfully slow? And does the Secretary-General agree that what is needed is a policy group for church buildings?
Thank you. I do agree that it has taken considerable time to get the member-level bodies together, and I regret that. The joint group referred to in my answer is now meeting, and I'm confident that it will make good progress, chaired as it is by the Chairman of the Church Buildings Council.
Number 62. Supplementary.
Sarah Schofield, Lichfield 147. When looking at corporate travel possibilities, could you also, William, consider working with the diocese to find a way to assist Synod members and possibly future Synod members who are on low incomes, who might not have the available funds to pay out for travel and accommodation and wait for reimbursement? When I did my tax return, I realised that my husband had to sub me £3,000 over the course of the previous tax year for Synod, Archbishop's Council and associated things. I'm lucky he has a job.
Thank you, Sarah. Yes, let's by all means look at that. And if you have particular things you want to raise with me or Jackie, we'd be very interested to hear about your ideas.
Thank you. Number 63. 64. 65. Ms. Daly.
Supplementary. Prudence Daly, 376 Oxford. Can the National Society Council envisage any circumstances whatsoever under which it might seek to defend freedom of conscience where this conflicted with the policies of a particular school?
Well, I'm reluctant to answer hypothetical questions that don't arise in particular cases, other than that I would say that our priority always, and as in valuing God's children and the purpose behind it, is the protection of children and their safety in school. Of course, we support all opportunities for the Christian faith to be presented in our deeply Christian schools, but our priority in this case is always to protect the children against any kind of bullying, and that includes transphobic, biphobic and homophobic bullying.
Thank you. Sir Tony Baldry has morphed into the answer of questions, as he's going to answer question 66 and some following ones. 66. 67.
Supplemental.
Supplementary.
Jonathan Alderson Ford, Eds and Ips. Would Sir
Number?
Tony... Oh, sorry, yes, of course. 207. I think that's a good number, yeah. Would Sir Tony be pleased if the whole of Synod could join with me in thanking the Second Estates Commissioner for a wonderful piece of work by saying hallelujah. 1, 2, 3. Hallelujah. Because it's great that this money's been done, and would he agree with me that we still need to maintain a dialogue so that this scheme can continue beyond 2020?
And of course 2020 is just the government spending round, and so that's why it ends in 2020, and I think we'd all want to see the scheme continue beyond 2020. Of course, though, when we leave the European Union, it will be for Parliament to set up new VAT rules, and so we'll probably be having to engage on government on that area in some detail.
68, Mr. Cordell.
Supplementary, Simon Cordell, Hereford 127. Thank you again for your full answer. Can you confirm that members of this body will be included in the envisaged consultation later in this year, and also by what means the mechanism to change the rules will be when you come back to Synod in July of next year?
Well, can I just say the faculty rules, we want to be as light touch and as flexible as possible, and if anyone thinks that any of the faculty rules aren't working effectively, please submit your ideas to Church House, and in terms of consultation, we will consult widely through DACs and through dioceses and diocesan synods, but essentially, we are open for ideas, and we want this to be as light touch and as effective as possible.
Thank you. 69. 70 and 71 being taken together. 70. 71. 72. Yes, supplementary to 72.
Catherine Grills, Birmingham 63. Thank you for your answer and the comment. It's clear that more resources at national level would help and that you're working towards achieving them. Could you just remind Synod what resources are currently available through the dedicated officer and what you're hoping for?
I will have to write to the honourable member on that and to give actual detail what exactly, and I will make sure they are put on the Church Care website.
Thank you. 73.
Supplementary.
Supplementary, Mr. Freeman.
John Freeman, 278 Chester. Thanks to Tony for your reply and also our discussion in the tea room. And I would just like you to carry back to the CBC for them to consider the value of a Georgian pew when it is holding up mission in their deliberations. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, our churches, let's be clear about this, our parish churches exist to fulfill the mission of the church. And what is essential is that the whole process of faculty and so on supports the mission of the church. Our churches are, they may have some important heritage, but they are not museums. So we have to make sure that our chancellors and others enable us to fulfill the church's mission. And I think we'll all watch with considerable interest the decision of the Dean of the Arches in the Bath Abbey case. But I'm not in the business, and I want to make it quite clear, the Church Buildings Council is not in the business for preserving church pews just for the sake of preserving church pews.
'74, Bishop Peter to reply.
Yes, I ask this question on behalf of Karen Galloway, who unfortunately is ill and not able to be here as she'd wished. And the question is, in the light of the establishment of the Orthodox Round Table, is it the intention that representatives from the long-standing Archbishops' Consultative Councils for the Romanian Orthodox and Russian Orthodox churches will still be part of this new initiative?
I'm sorry, I missed the first part of your question as I was trying to get to the podium. Could you repeat, please?
Indeed. In the light of the establishment of the Orthodox Round Table, is it the intention that representatives from the long-standing Archbishops' Consultative Councils for the Romanian Orthodox and Russian Orthodox churches will still be part of this new initiative?
The round table, I may be misunderstanding your question. The round table is intended to welcome in any groups who are involved and interested. It's a forum where people can join in rather than having a formal membership, and that's important. If you've got a more detailed question that I didn't understand, please write to me and I'll reply.
Thank you. This next one's probably our last question, number 75. Canon John Spence to reply. Supplementary. Dr. Richmond.
Richmond 180, Norwich. Thank you so much for answering such a long and boring question. And it seems that there is an expectation of more money being required if retirements are going to increase because of the age profile of our clergy. Is there any expectation that money is going to be saved and that dioceses are not going to be needing so much of an injection of money, or is that mistaken?
John Spence, Archbishop's Council, I can assure you I never find your questions boring. I think what we're discovering, and I'm very grateful that we now have received diocesan replies from over 90% of all dioceses. What's coming out of that is some emerging trends around what's the ageing profile of the bishops, changing retirement ages. There are different stages to which dioceses have been able to complete detailed people planning. We are into an intense period of consultation. I met with some diocesan secretaries earlier today, and I do think that if there is going to be any case for seeking additional funds from beyond those resources available to the Archbishop's Council, it will be essential for us to demonstrate that we have done everything we can to save money along the way and to pool all our resources so that the Church has a whole Church response in order that we can create, to use the words that the Archbishop employed earlier today, a Church for all the people of England. Talking about boring, can I apologise to those members of Synod who have complained that my tie today is unusually dull? Mrs. Spence is in charge of all matters sartorial, and I will do better tomorrow.
Thank you, Canon Spence. That brings us to the end of question time. We've done very well to get through 75 questions in 9 minutes, so thank you all for your forbearance in being as succinct as possible. We do now move on to a time of worship. We've earned that, after which we will be dismissed by the Archbishop.